The sea off the coast of Normandy was gray on the morning that would change the century. Waves rolled in under a low cloud ceiling, dragging long strands of foam toward the sand. Out there, beyond the white line of surf, thousands of young men waited in landing craft that rocked and shuddered with every swell. Engines coughed, metal clanged. Someone retched quietly over the side. Someone else bowed his head and prayed. On the bridge of the cruiser, USS Augusta, a tall, slightly stooped officer, stood with his hands locked lightly behind his back. His uniform was neat but plain. His cap sat low, shading eyes that seemed more thoughtful than dramatic. He did not bark orders. He did not strike poses for photographers. He spoke softly, if at all, as he watched the small dark shapes of landing craft crawling toward the hostile shore. This was Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley, the man entrusted with leading the American landings on Omaha and Utah beaches, and soon, with commanding the largest body of American soldiers ever to fight under one man's authority. History would remember him as the soldier's general, a commander known less for spectacle than for decency, less for speeches than for responsibility. To the men who would soon run up those beaches under fire, he was not a distant figure on a map. He was the quiet mind that had tried, in every way possible, to give them a fighting chance to live. The noise of the invasion had not yet reached the ship. On the horizon, the bombardment had begun. Flashes of light from the broadsides of battleships, the slow, heavy rumble of naval guns rolling back over the water. Far inland, unseen from the bridge, paratroopers who had jumped during the night were already scattered across the fields and hedgerows of France, searching for their units, their landmarks, their objectives. But on the Augusta, for a moment, there was still a kind of uneasy quiet. Bradley studied the shoreline through binoculars. He knew those contours, those exits, those bluffs, not as a tourist knows a landscape, but as a surgeon knows an anatomy. Each contour a possible artery, each ravine a place where men might die if the plan failed by even a small margin. He had spent months poring over aerial photographs and intelligence reports, asking questions others sometimes considered excessive. How strong were the currents? How deep was the water at low tide? Could tanks make it over the shingle? What would happen if the first wave was cut down? Where could engineers work under fire? How long could a man survive in that cold water if his landing craft was hit too far out? These were not glamorous questions, but they were the questions of a man who believed that every preventable death was a kind of failure of leadership. Shortly after dawn on June 6, 1944, the first wave hit Omaha Beach. Things went wrong almost at once. Strong currents carried some landing craft east of their intended zones. Others came in too close to heavily defended sectors. Tanks designed to swim ashore in support of the infantry sank in the rough water, dragging crews to the bottom. The German defenses, largely intact in this sector, opened fire with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. From the bridge, Bradley could not see every detail of the disaster unfolding on the sand, but the reports coming in over the radio were grim. Units were pinned down. Casualties were heavy. Some companies were losing more than half their men in the first minutes. The beach, meant to be a gateway into Europe, threatened to become a killing ground. Senior officers around Bradley began to consider the unthinkable, pulling the survivors off Omaha and shifting forces elsewhere. The logic was brutal but clear. If the beach was too strong, if the landing was failing, they might be throwing away thousands of lives for nothing. Perhaps the effort should be abandoned while there was still time. Bradley listened. He asked questions. He weighed the reports. He did not pace. He did not shout. He did not slam a fist onto the plotting table. For men who did not know him, his quietness might have looked like uncertainty. But those who had served with him in North Africa and Sicily understood that this silence was his way of thinking, of gathering the many threads of a crisis and drawing them together into a decision. He knew that if he ordered a withdrawal now, in those first terrible hours, the consequences would be enormous. The Americans might have to attempt a second landing somewhere else, under even worse conditions, and with the enemy fully alert. The entire Allied timetable for liberating Western Europe could be thrown into chaos. The Germans, encouraged by a repulsed landing, might shift large forces to the west and prolong the war for months, perhaps years. And yet he also knew that stubbornness for its own sake was not courage. Sending wave after wave of men into a hopeless situation would not be leadership. It would be slaughter. So he asked the key question: was Omaha hopeless, or was it just terrible? The difference between those two words, in that moment, measured the fate of thousands. Reports began to trickle in of small groups of soldiers finding ways forward, using gaps in the wire, scraping up sandy slopes under cover of smoke, inching along ditches and ravines where the German fire could not rake them as easily. Engineers were blowing obstacles under fire. Rangers and infantry were beginning to climb the bluffs. The first German positions were being silenced one by one. The situation was still desperate, but it was no longer hopeless. Bradley made his decision. The landings would continue. The beach would be reinforced, not abandoned. The men already there would not be left to die on a shoreline their country had asked them to seize. That choice, made not with a dramatic declaration but with a steady, quiet resolve, helped secure the bridgehead that made the liberation of Western Europe possible. In later years, many loud voices would claim credit for victory. Generals with colorful reputations, politicians with strong speeches, writers and filmmakers searching for drama in war. But the decision on that gray morning off Normandy belonged to a man who had never sought the spotlight, a man whose first instinct was to think of the soldiers on the beach, not the headlines that might follow. To understand Omar Bradley, to understand why his soldiers and many veterans of that generation held him in such respect, we must step away from that ship for a moment and look backward to a small town in Missouri, a modest family, and a boy who learned early that responsibility is not something you talk about. It is something you carry. For Bradley did not arrive at Normandy as a fully formed historical figure. He arrived as a human being shaped by loss, by discipline, by long years of invisible work in an army that often overlooked quiet men. His success in World War II was not the product of sudden genius revealed by crisis, but of a character built slowly, almost anonymously, across decades. Older viewers who lived through the war years, or who grew up in families marked by them, will recognize in Bradley a type that once seemed more common: the man who does his duty without show, who rarely raises his voice, who worries more about the people under his care than about his own advancement. Many fathers and grandfathers of that generation were like that. In Bradley, those everyday virtues found their way into the high command of a global conflict. He would go on to lead the 12th United States Army Group, an enormous force of more than 1 million men advancing across France and into Germany. He would sit in discussions with Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery, and other towering figures of the Allied leadership, weighing the risks of each offensive, each river crossing, each push toward the heart of the Reich. He would have to decide when to advance and when to pause, when to press an advantage and when to preserve lives, when to agree with more aggressive subordinates and when to restrain them. It is tempting, when we look back at such a man, to see him only through the lens of rank and medals, the 5-star insignia he would eventually wear, the titles, General of the Army, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that marked his later career. But in this story, we will try to see him differently, not as a statue on a pedestal, but as a human being moving through time. We will walk with him in the dusty streets of Clark and Moberly, Missouri, where a young boy learned the meaning of work and loss. We will follow him through the gray stone corridors of West Point, where he forged friendships and habits that would last a lifetime. We will see him teaching cadets, studying tactics, patiently preparing for a war he did not yet know was coming. We will stand with him on the edges of battlefields in North Africa and Sicily, where he first learned what it meant to send men into danger and to carry the memory of those who did not return. And then, when we return to Normandy, to the Ardennes, to the Rhine, we will see those great decisions not as abstract maneuvers on a map, but as the choice of a man whose deepest instinct was to protect the lives of his soldiers, while still accomplishing the mission his country had given him. For those in our audience who lived through air raid sirens, ration books, and telegrams, or whose parents and grandparents spoke in quiet tones about the boys who didn't come back, Bradley's story will resonate as more than a military biography. It is a reminder of a particular kind of leadership that many now feel has grown rare. Leadership that combines competence with humility, authority with humanity. He never claimed to be a genius. He did not pretend to be infallible. He made mistakes, some of them serious, and we will examine those too. Decisions around Falaise, around the command structure in the Battle of the Bulge, moments where historians still argue whether he should have acted differently. But through it all, one pattern emerges. Omar Bradley tried, with all the tools he had, to be worthy of the trust placed in him, the trust of his superiors, of his allies, and above all, of the ordinary soldiers who called him our general. On that morning in June 1944, as the landing craft closed in on Omaha Beach and the Atlantic wind pressed against the open bridge of the Augusta, he stood not as a distant symbol of power, but as the final link in a chain of responsibility stretching from the small farm towns of America to the cliffs of Normandy. And so we begin. Not with the crash of artillery or the triumphant music of victory parades, but with a quiet man watching young soldiers move toward danger, measuring each report, and making a decision that could not be undone. From this moment, our story will move back in time to understand how such a man came to stand at such a place, at such a moment, in a world at war. The America into which Omar Nelson Bradley was born in 1893 was still a country finding its identity. The Civil War had ended less than 3 decades earlier. The frontier, though closing, could still be felt in the national character. Railroads stitched the continent together, carrying coal, timber, cattle, and people toward new beginnings. Electricity had not yet reached most rural towns. And in the quiet heart of Missouri, among fields and modest wooden houses, the Bradley family lived a life defined by simplicity and the steady rhythms of work. Omar's birthplace, the small town of Clark, was exactly the kind of community that shaped the generations soon to come of age during the First World War. Life was not easy, but neither was it joyless. For families like the Bradleys, fulfillment came from structure, routine, and shared duty. A culture in which every member, even a young child, understood that their contribution mattered. His father, John Smith Bradley, was a school teacher. Not a wealthy profession, but a respected one in a town where education symbolized progress and hope. John believed deeply in the power of learning. He often told his sons, Omar and his younger brother John, that a man who could read well and think clearly would never be wholly poor, no matter what money he did or didn't have. Omar's mother, Mary Elizabeth, was the sort of woman common in that generation, but increasingly rare today, strict but kind, endlessly practical, and fiercely protective of her children. She came from a lineage of hardworking farmers, and she brought into the home not only discipline, but also emotional resilience. In an era without modern conveniences, she cooked, cleaned, managed the household accounts, taught the children, and helped neighbors when they fell sick, all without complaint. This environment imprinted on Omar qualities that would later make him extraordinary: patience, humility, focus, and an unshakable dedication to duty. There was nothing extraordinary about the Bradleys' financial circumstances. They lived modestly, rarely indulged in unnecessary expenses, and made do with what they had. Yet Omar never remembered his childhood as deprived. Like many who grew up in that era, he understood that comfort was measured not by wealth, but by stability and love. A childhood of modesty and discipline. The young Omar spent his early years exploring the fields and creeks around Clark, fishing for catfish in summer and helping gather wood in winter. Such chores weren't considered punishments. They were a natural part of life. Every child contributed, and every task, no matter how small, held meaning. He also attended school where his father taught. Under John Bradley's guidance, Omar absorbed not only arithmetic and reading, but also the quiet dignity of scholarship. Teachers who later reflected on him described him as a serious boy, exceptionally polite, and unwilling to draw attention to himself. These were not labels glamorous to an ambitious youth, but they would prove foundational when he became responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But childhood's serenity never lasts forever. The tragedy that shaped him. When Omar was 15, tragedy entered his life abruptly. His father fell ill with pneumonia, a condition far deadlier in 1908 than today. Within days, John Bradley's condition deteriorated, and despite the best efforts of local doctors and neighbors, he passed away. For a boy of 15, losing the emotional pillar of the family was devastating. For a family already living modestly, it was catastrophic. The stability Mary had fought so hard to maintain crumbled overnight. She now faced the impossible task of providing for her sons alone, in a time when opportunities for widowed women were painfully limited. Many teenagers might have rebelled under such pressure, but Omar responded differently. He grew quieter, more introspective, more responsible. He took on small jobs. He helped with bills. He supported his mother emotionally in ways few boys his age could have managed. This early confrontation with hardship forged a particular attitude toward leadership, one grounded not in ego, but in responsibility. Years later, soldiers often remarked that Bradley treated their lives as if they were his own sons. This was not sentimentality. It was the result of a lesson learned through loss. Responsibility, and he later said, is something you learn best when you cannot avoid it. It is no exaggeration to say that the quiet, careful man who guided the American army through Normandy was born in this moment of childhood grief. The world around him. The Missouri of Bradley's youth was a place of horse-drawn wagons, church picnics, local baseball games, and community gatherings. Evenings were lit by kerosene lamps. Winters demanded stoicism. Summers demanded labor. He walked miles to school across dirt roads. He hunted for small game with neighbors. He played baseball for hours on uneven fields, worn down by generations of children before him. Every part of this life, while simple, contributed to his personality. Hunting taught patience and calculation, qualities vital in command. Baseball taught teamwork and timing, crucial in coordinating large-scale operations. Chores taught responsibility without fanfare. The essence of Bradley's leadership. Family tragedies taught emotional steadiness, the ability to keep composure under pressure. This era, remembered fondly by many older Americans, produced a generation unlike any before or after. They were shaped not by convenience, but by necessity, not by abundance, but by discipline. Many who fought in World War II, including thousands who served under Bradley, came from similar towns, similar homes, similar hardships. For viewers of older generations, this period may evoke memories of their own parents or grandparents, people who lived simply but carried themselves with quiet honor. A quiet boy with an unexpected mind. Academically, Omar was strong but not dazzling. His grades were consistently high, but he lacked the arrogance and theatrical brilliance of some classmates. Teachers described him as deeply reliable, methodical, intellectually disciplined, always prepared. He did not talk much in class, nor did he display any natural inclination toward leadership. In fact, many later found it surprising that the reserved young man from Clark would become a general famous for commanding over 1 million soldiers. Yet those who knew him best saw hints of something deeper. One teacher recalled, when he listened completely. When he made a decision, he did not reverse it. This capacity for focus, rare in boys his age, would later become one of Bradley's greatest battlefield strengths. The most important figure Principal Hawkins. Among the many people who shaped Bradley's early life, one stands almost alone in influence: his high school principal, Eugene W. Hawkins. Hawkins perceived in the quiet, polite teenager a rare combination of intelligence and steadiness. He often spoke to Bradley after class, encouraging him to think beyond the boundaries of rural Missouri. It was Hawkins who first suggested West Point. He explained that the military academy offered not only a world-class education, but a full scholarship, a blessing Bradley desperately needed after his father's death. Initially, Omar dismissed the idea. He was shy, humble, and did not see himself as officer material. Military life seemed foreign, even intimidating. He imagined becoming an engineer or teacher, not a soldier. But Hawkins persisted. He gave Bradley pamphlets. He wrote letters. He advocated for him with the local congressman, the only person who could appoint candidates to West Point. Eventually, Bradley agreed to apply, not out of ambition, but gratitude. He wanted to honor Hawkins's faith in him, and he knew that an education, especially one he did not have to pay for, was a rare opportunity for a boy in his circumstances. In later life, after becoming one of America's most respected generals, Bradley would reflect, "Had it not been for Mr. Hawkins, I would never have worn a uniform, never seen the world, never known the army that became my life." This decision, half chance, half persuasion, would alter the course of history. For without Omar Bradley, the American army in Europe would have looked very different. Leaving home. The summer before leaving for West Point was one of mixed emotions. Bradley worked odd jobs to help his mother. He visited his father's grave often. He took long walks along familiar country roads, knowing he might never live in Clark again. The town held a small farewell gathering. Neighbors brought food, shared stories, and wished him luck. In communities like Clark, a boy going to West Point was the closest thing to a celebrity moment. People shook his hand with genuine pride. But behind this pride lay something deeper, an understanding of sacrifice. For rural families, sending a son away was always bittersweet. Many mothers of that generation watched their boys leave home for military service, not knowing if they would return. Though Bradley was only going to school, not war, Mary Bradley felt that same ache, the ache of letting go. Omar promised he would write often. He hugged his mother quietly, without tears. Then, carrying a single suitcase and wearing a plain suit, he boarded the train eastward, toward New York, toward the Hudson River, toward the stone fortress of the United States Military Academy. He looked out the window for a long time, as the fields of Missouri faded into distance. He was not yet a soldier, not yet a leader, not yet the calm mind who would steady Allied forces on some of the most dangerous days of the 20th century. But the journey had begun. The train that carried Omar Bradley across the country toward New York passed through landscapes he had only seen in books. He watched the green hills of the Midwest flatten into plains, watched farms give way to industrial towns, watched the wide Mississippi shrink in the distance. Everything seemed larger, faster, louder than the quiet life he had known. For a boy from rural Missouri, it felt as if he were traveling into another world entirely. In truth, he was. At 17 years old, Omar arrived at West Point, the United States Military Academy, the oldest and most demanding institution of military education in the nation. What waited for him inside those granite walls was not simply schooling, it was a transformation. West Point did not shape young men through inspiration alone. It shaped them through pressure, discipline, repetition, and an unrelenting schedule designed to break bad habits and forge something firmer in their place. Few places in America could turn quiet boys into steady leaders as effectively or as brutally as West Point in the early 20th century. For Bradley, entering the academy felt like stepping into history. The names of legendary generals echoed through the halls: Grant, Sherman, Pershing, MacArthur. He felt small walking under portraits of graduates who had commanded armies and shaped nations. But he did not come here to seek greatness. He came here because he needed an education, and because a mentor believed he had potential. For him, that was enough. Yet from the very first day, he faced a test of character more intense than anything he had known. Reception day, the shattering of boyhood. On his first morning, Bradley and the other new cadets, known as plebes, were greeted not by warmth but by sharp orders, rigid rules, and a museum-like stillness broken only by the echo of boots on stone. Upperclassmen shouted instructions with machine-like precision. Every movement, every word, even the way a cadet stood or breathed, seemed subject to scrutiny. West Point's goal was not cruelty, it was uniformity, discipline, obedience, and above all, the ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that would be vital years later, when men like Bradley faced far greater stresses on the battlefields of Europe. Omar adjusted quickly. He did not push back. He did not question. He accepted the system as he accepted hardship in childhood, quietly, patiently, with a sense of duty. Some plebes broke down, some argued. Some transferred out within the first month. Bradley did not. He endured. He later recalled, "At West Point, you learned to stand still when you wanted to move, to listen when you wanted to speak, and to think when others lost their heads." This ability, the gift of calm, would become Bradley's defining feature. Academic rigor, more than military training. West Point was not merely a military school, it was one of the finest academic institutions in the nation. Its curriculum, rooted in engineering, mathematics, and applied sciences, demanded focus and long hours of study. Bradley's strengths fit perfectly with the Academy's expectations. He excelled in mathematics, thanks to his father's early lessons. He appreciated structure, having grown up in a disciplined household. He studied consistently, never allowing himself to fall behind. He wrote clearly, reflecting a mind that worked in straight lines rather than tangled knots. He was not top of his class, but he was solidly above average, 44th out of 164. More importantly, he was respected for his integrity. A cadet who was never reprimanded, never cut corners, never tried to impress instructors with dramatics. In a world where many cadets competed fiercely for recognition, Bradley seemed indifferent to rank. He wanted to do well, but not at the cost of reputation or fairness. A class steeped in destiny. The West Point class of 1915 would later be called the class the stars fell on. Of the 164 graduates, 59 would become generals. Among them, Dwight D. Eisenhower, future Supreme Allied Commander and President of the United States. James Van Fleet, who would command armies in Korea. Joseph T. McNarney, future commander of U.S. forces in Europe. Henry Orand, a respected logistics expert. To be surrounded by such talent might have intimidated some, but Bradley did not compete. He did not seek to outshine these men. Instead, he observed them. He learned from them. He recognized strengths in others and quietly developed his own. This humility would later influence Eisenhower's trust in him. Ike respected men who could lead without theatrics, men who could carry responsibility without letting ambition cloud their judgment. The daily rhythm of a cadet's life. Cadet life was relentless, revel at dawn, physical drills in the crisp morning air, academic classes stretching late into the afternoon, tactical training inspections, evening study hours. Lights out with no exceptions. Every day was an exercise in discipline, and every cadet quickly learned that the academy left no room for laziness or excuses. For many, this life created tension and burnout. But for Bradley, it brought comfort. He had grown up with chores, structure, and responsibility. Discipline was not a burden. It was familiar. He found small joys in routine. The rhythmic sound of marching feet on the parade field, the crisp fold of a well-made bed, the satisfaction of polishing shoes until they reflected the window light, the camaraderie of shared struggle. Many who looked back on their West Point years remembered stress and humiliation. Bradley remembered formation, the gradual shaping of a young man into someone capable of commanding others. Athletics and the team mindset. While academics shaped Bradley's mind, sports shaped his character. He became a devoted baseball player, serving as a shortstop. a position requiring quick reflexes, sharp judgment, calm under pressure, the ability to coordinate with teammates. Bradley was never the star of the team, but he was its anchor, reliable, predictable, consistent. A teammate later said, "In tight moments, Bradley never rushed. He never hesitated. He made the play the way it needed to be made." This steadiness mirrored his later command style. Careful, methodical, rarely reckless. He also boxed recreationally, not to win matches, but to stay fit and maintain discipline. Boxing, to Bradley, was about balance and timing, not bravado. Relationships and friendships. Bradley was not a social butterfly. He attended gatherings, joined conversations, and shared meals, but he was rarely the loudest voice in the room. His classmates saw him as reliable and sincere, the kind of man one could trust with a confidence or rely on during hardship. His friendship with Dwight Eisenhower began modestly, casual conversations, shared practices on the athletic field, but it grew into a professional respect that lasted decades. While not close friends at the academy, they understood each other, two men who valued discipline, fairness, and clarity over ego. Some cadets found Bradley too quiet. Others saw him as overly serious. But nearly everyone agreed he was one of the kindest men at West Point, a cadet who never humiliated others, never abused authority, and never forgot what it felt like to be young and uncertain. This empathy, rare in military institutions, would become one of Bradley's most distinctive leadership traits. The forging of a leader, not in dramatic moments, but silent ones. There were no dramatic incidents that defined Bradley's West Point experience. No fights, no scandals, no heroic rescues. His transformation occurred more subtly. It happened in the long hours of study after midnight, the discipline of daily drills, the quiet acceptance of criticism, the refusal to cut corners, the steady practice of fairness and restraint. These qualities prepared him not for a life of glory, but for a life of responsibility, a responsibility that would one day involve the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. For many older viewers who remember the values of early 20th century America, this kind of upbringing feels familiar. Bradley was not forged by privilege. He was forged by work, by hardship, and by the belief that character mattered more than charisma. Graduation and the threshold of a new century. On June 12, 1915, Omar Bradley graduated from the United States Military Academy and accepted his commission as a second lieutenant in the infantry. He left West Point not as a famous man, not as an ambitious officer, but as a quiet, thoughtful leader with a firm moral compass and a deep sense of duty. He did not imagine that his class would someday shape the direction of a world war. He did not foresee that he would one day command the largest American force ever assembled in battle. He simply knew that he had been prepared to lead, to think, to endure. As he stepped away from the academy grounds, he carried with him the lessons that would guide him through the darkness of global conflict and the weight of decisions few men in history have had to make. The world he would soon serve, however, was on the verge of unimaginable change. And Omar Bradley, the quiet boy from Missouri, now a young officer shaped by West Point, walked unknowingly toward a destiny far greater than anything he had dared imagine. When Omar Bradley left West Point in 1915 and received his commission as a brand new second lieutenant, he entered an American army very different from the force he would later command in Europe. It was small, underfunded, scattered across distant posts, and uncertain of its place in a changing world. The United States was not yet a global power. It still viewed itself as a nation secure behind two oceans, hesitant to involve itself in Europe's ancient rivalries. For the next quarter of a century, long before he became a household name, Bradley lived through years that shaped him far more deeply than outsiders ever realized. They were not years of glory. There were no battles, no medals, no dramatic successes. Instead, they were years of patient growth, of quiet learning, of watching and absorbing. They were, in truth, the years during which Omar Bradley became the man capable of leading 1 million soldiers in war. This chapter is not filled with explosions or battlefield heroism. It is filled with something subtler and perhaps more important: the deliberate construction of a mind trained for war and a heart trained for responsibility. The quiet beginning of a military life. Bradley's first assignments were unremarkable. The Army sent him to frontier-style posts in the American West, places where the landscape was vast, the duties routine, and the days long. He supervised training, inspected equipment, drilled soldiers, and learned the rhythms of Army life. He lived in simple quarters, often shared with other junior officers. Meals were plain, conversations modest, and entertainment limited to reading, sports, and occasional trips into town. Officers were expected to conduct themselves with dignity, even in remote outposts. Many failed. Bradley did not. But it was not long before the world changed around him. World War I, the war. He did not fight. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, and thousands of officers begged for combat assignments. Young men everywhere dreamed of proving themselves on the battlefields of France. Bradley, too, prepared. He trained recruits, drilled new units, and expected orders to deploy across the Atlantic. They never came. Instead, he was assigned to guard duty at mines and industrial facilities in the American West. Vital but unglamorous work. He supervised troops who protected copper mines in Montana, ensuring that the war's essential raw materials kept flowing. He was responsible for discipline, logistics, and morale, tasks that rarely earned medals, but often determined whether a unit could function effectively. Many officers complained that they were being denied a chance to become heroes. Bradley did not. He later explained, "A soldier's duty is where the Army needs him, not where the glory lies." It is a character trait typical of his generation, especially appreciated by older viewers who remember the humility of their fathers and grandfathers, men who worked quietly without expecting praise. This acceptance of duty without bitterness shaped the general he would become: practical, steady, and focused on what mattered, not what was dramatic. A career in slow motion. The end of World War I in 1918 left Bradley at a crossroads. Unlike officers who had fought in France and returned as decorated veterans, Bradley had no battlefield experience. The Army shrank rapidly in the 1920s. Promotions slowed so drastically that many officers left the service entirely. Bradley stayed, not because of ambition, but because he believed the Army offered him purpose and stability, and because he was good at what he did. During these years, he moved from post to post: Nogales, Arizona, El Paso; Texas Yosemite area in California; Camp Lewis, Washington. Each assignment taught him something new about leadership and logistics. The quiet, unglamorous foundations of war. He learned how to manage supply shortages, how to motivate soldiers isolated from home, how to maintain discipline without crushing morale, how to build trust in units where men came from vastly different backgrounds. None of these lessons would make headlines. All of them would, one day, help win a war. The most important stage: returning to West Point as an instructor. In 1920, Bradley received orders that would define his future far more than any battlefield. He was assigned to return to West Point, this time as an instructor of mathematics. Teaching might sound like a step backward for an officer seeking advancement. Yet, for Bradley, it became a crucible. His students would remember him as patient, clear-thinking, honest, disciplined, and surprisingly compassionate for a military instructor. He never humiliated cadets. He never abused authority. He never raised his voice. These traits contradicted the harsh stereotypes of West Point teaching. Cadets respected him because he treated them like men, not subordinates to be broken. One former cadet recalled, "Bradley had the rare ability to correct you without making you feel small." This simple human quality, respect, would later set him apart from more flamboyant generals. Growing under the shadow of greatness. George C. Marshall. In the early 1930s, Bradley was assigned to the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he came under the influence of one of America's greatest military minds, General George C. Marshall, the future Army Chief of Staff. Marshall was legendary for his ability to identify talent. He had no interest in loud personalities or schemers. He valued officers who were calm under stress, honest in word and deed, intellectually curious, free from ego, and capable of making clear, rapid decisions. Bradley fit those qualities perfectly. Marshall took note. Bradley never bragged about Marshall's support. But without this connection, built on merit, not friendship, the quiet officer from Missouri might never have risen high enough to command armies in World War II. Marshall would later say that Bradley was one of the ablest officers the Army had at the time. Coming from Marshall, these words were equivalent to a medal. A crucible of learning, the Command and General Staff School. In 1928, Bradley entered the Army's elite school for future senior leaders, the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth. This school was not about bravery. It was about thinking. Cold, logical, precise thinking under pressure. Officers were trained in maneuver warfare, logistics planning, corps-level and Army-level operations, map analysis, intelligence evaluation, and contingency planning under uncertainty. Bradley thrived. He did not dazzle instructors the way Patton had years earlier, but he demonstrated something rarer: consistency of judgment. He made solid decisions again and again. He earned the reputation of a man who would never panic under pressure, never be blinded by ambition, never be swept away by emotion. He graduated near the top of his class. Another quiet milestone, another brick in the foundation of the general he would become. A military without money. The Great Depression. The 1930s were unkind to the U.S. Army. The Great Depression forced budget cuts so severe that training exercises were conducted with wooden mock-ups instead of real tanks and machine guns. Ammunition was scarce. Soldiers sometimes used stones to simulate grenades. This was not the mighty army that would one day land in Normandy. It was an army struggling to survive. Yet, in these lean years, Bradley learned something priceless: innovation under shortage. He learned to improvise. He learned to stretch resources. He learned to command without the luxury of overwhelming firepower. This would prove essential in North Africa and Sicily, where the American Army was inexperienced and often under-equipped. Teaching leadership, not just mathematics. Bradley returned to West Point again in the early 1930s, not as a mathematics instructor this time, but as a leader shaping cadets' character. He monitored discipline. He counseled struggling cadets. He became a model of the values the Academy wanted to instill. His reputation grew. A man of integrity, fairness, and steady competence. Cadets trusted him instinctively, and their trust would one day be mirrored by hundreds of thousands of soldiers on European battlefields. The Army begins to modernize, slowly. By the late 1930s, with war clouds gathering in Europe and Asia, the American Army began preparing cautiously, hesitantly, for a conflict many hoped could be avoided. New equipment arrived, training intensified, large-scale exercises returned. And Bradley, now a colonel, was placed in increasingly important roles. He became assistant commandant of the infantry school, where he oversaw the education of officers who would later serve under him in World War II. This role allowed him to shape the future through teaching, through mentoring, and through insisting on realism in training. He would later say, "If we train honestly, fewer men will die in war." This philosophy guided everything he did. A career built not on noise, but on steadiness. By 1941, as the world moved inexorably toward global conflict, Bradley had become a respected officer, a skilled planner, a gifted educator, a trusted subordinate of Marshall, a man known for fairness, humility, and clear judgment. He had no fame, no dramatic achievements, no reputation outside military circles. But the Army, specifically George Marshall, knew exactly who he was. And when the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Marshall began assembling the leadership team he believed could defeat the Axis. Omar Bradley was on that list. He was the quiet officer many outsiders overlooked, the man who had spent 26 years preparing for a war he had never fought. Now, that war had arrived, and Bradley's real life, the life for which he had unknowingly been preparing since childhood, was about to begin. When the Army called, he was ready. When the United States finally entered World War II in December 1941, Omar Bradley was 50 years old, an age by which many officers had already reached their peak. He had never commanded troops in battle. He had never heard live artillery shells explode over his head. He had never walked among foxholes or spoken to soldiers trembling before combat. He had spent decades preparing for war, yet had never tasted it. Now history called. The U.S. Army, expanding at a speed never seen before, needed leaders who were not merely ambitious, but competent, steady, and free from ego. And so Bradley, the quiet, unnoticed colonel from Missouri, suddenly found himself thrust into the greatest conflict the world had ever known. But before he could command an army in Europe, he had to prove himself in the harsh, unforgiving deserts of North Africa, where the American army would face its first brutal lessons of modern warfare. A new assignment, reporting for duty under Eisenhower. In early 1942, General George Marshall, now the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, began placing his most trusted officers into key positions. One of the first men he summoned was Bradley. Marshall told him plainly, "You are too valuable to remain in training roles. You're going overseas." Bradley was ordered to join General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean. Eisenhower needed reliable officers, men who could lead without theatrics, men who could balance the volatile personalities around them. Bradley, with his steady demeanor and calm judgment, was a perfect fit. He was assigned initially not as a battlefield commander, but as Eisenhower's personal observer and troubleshooter, a role uniquely suited to a man who could see problems clearly without becoming entangled in politics. This quiet beginning would soon lead to something far greater. The American Army's first harsh lesson, Kasserine Pass. When Bradley arrived in North Africa, the American Army was inexperienced and untested. Its officers had never faced the German Wehrmacht in open battle. Its soldiers were brave but green. Its logistics, communications, and tactics were unrefined. The Germans, meanwhile, were veterans of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, hardened and deadly. The collision came in February 1943 at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. It was a disaster. German forces under the brilliant Field Marshal Erwin Rommel broke through inexperienced American units, sending them retreating in confusion. Lines collapsed, communication faltered, and American casualties mounted. Equipment was abandoned, morale shaken. From his vantage as Eisenhower's representative, Bradley watched the battle unfold and immediately understood the problem. The American Army did not yet know how to fight a modern war. More importantly, its leadership was failing. The man in command of two corps, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, was cautious to the point of paralysis, issuing orders from a headquarters dug deep into a remote canyon far from the front. He barely visited his troops. Some officers didn't even know what he looked like. Bradley, quietly but decisively, recommended that Fredendall be relieved. Eisenhower agreed. In that moment, Bradley demonstrated something essential. He was not merely a gentleman. He was a decisive one, capable of making hard judgments when lives depended on it. Enter General George S. Patton, fire and steel. To replace Fredendall, Eisenhower needed a general who could restore discipline, confidence, and fighting spirit. He chose a man whose personality stood in absolute contrast to Bradley's, General George S. Patton. Patton was loud, aggressive, flamboyant, and theatrical, a man who almost seemed designed for Hollywood. He arrived wearing polished boots, a gleaming helmet, and ivory-handled pistols. He swore constantly, demanded discipline to the point of cruelty, and believed in attacking relentlessly day and night. Bradley was the complete opposite, quiet rather than loud. analytical rather than impulsive, patient rather than theatrical, humble rather than glory-seeking. And yet, these opposites formed an astonishingly effective partnership. Patton needed a steady second-in-command to balance his extremes. Bradley needed someone bold enough to take decisive action in chaos. Their differences strengthened their combined leadership. Eisenhower made Bradley deputy commander of 2 Corps under Patton, assigning him the critical job of reorganizing training, analyzing mistakes, and restoring the Army's confidence. It was here in the desert of Tunisia that Bradley first demonstrated his talent for leadership. Rebuilding 2 Corps. Bradley's influence. While Patton whipped the Army into discipline with precision and theatrics, Bradley worked quietly among the troops, visiting frontline positions, talking to enlisted men and junior officers, listening to complaints, inspecting equipment, studying terrain, identifying weaknesses in planning and organization. He rejected arrogance. He rejected the idea that men should fear their commanders. He believed in clear explanations, realistic training, and fairness. Soldiers who had distrusted their previous leadership began to feel something new under Bradley: confidence. One infantryman remembered, "Patton made you feel like you were part of a show. Bradley made you feel like you mattered." It was not showmanship, but genuine care. In desert heat that cracked lips and burned skin, in camps swept by sandstorms and nights where cold seeped through thin blankets, Bradley walked among his men quietly, asking simple questions. Are you eating well? Are your boots holding up? Is the ammunition getting to you on time? He took notes. He made changes. He earned trust. Bradley takes over, command of 2 Corps. In April 1943, after Patton was reassigned to prepare for the invasion of Sicily, Bradley received his first major combat command. He became the commander of 2 Corps. It was his moment of transition, from observer and assistant to field commander, responsible for thousands of lives, and he did not disappoint. Under Bradley's command, the 2nd Corps launched a series of offensives against German forces in Tunisia. Macnacy El Guettar Bizerte. While Patton favored bold, aggressive maneuvers, Bradley preferred methodical planning, supported by strong intelligence and logistics. His battles were not as dramatic, but they were effective. At El Guettar, American troops, including the 1st Infantry Division, repelled fierce German counterattacks with growing skill and cohesion. The lessons of Kasserine had been absorbed. The Army was maturing. Bradley's insistence on proper training and discipline paid off. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered over 275,000 German and Italian troops. The victory was shared among many Allied commanders, but Bradley had played a crucial role in transforming an inexperienced American force into a capable, confident army. The Bradley style: quiet leadership in a noisy war. Perhaps the clearest picture of Bradley's character comes from the men who served near him during this period. Unlike many generals, Bradley did not create distance between himself and his soldiers. He did not bark orders from a safe distance or hide behind maps. He ate the same food they did. He slept in similar tents. He walked through front-line positions without announcing himself. One officer recalled, "He asked questions as if he were one of us, not above us. But he always knew more than he let on." Bradley appeared simple on the surface, but he was sharp, observant, and analytical. He absorbed information like a sponge, quietly forming conclusions that guided his decisions. He also respected the chain of command, but was never intimidated by stronger personalities. With Patton, he maintained a professional balance, neither submissive nor confrontational. Patton once said, "Bradley is quiet, but don't fool yourself. He's tougher than he looks." North Africa proved it. A new reputation. The soldier's general. After the North African campaign, Bradley's name gained recognition, not for heroics, not for speeches, but for something older and more fundamental. Soldiers trusted him. In an army filled with personalities, Patton's fire, Montgomery's ego, Eisenhower's diplomacy, Bradley represented something different: familiarity, reliability, decency, steadiness. Older veterans often said that Bradley reminded them of their fathers or uncles, men who were firm but fair, disciplined but humane, serious but compassionate. He became known as the soldier's general. It was the greatest compliment he could receive. The stage is set towards Sicily, Italy, and France. By mid-1943, Bradley had accomplished something far more difficult than winning a battle. He had proven himself. In a war that demanded speed, aggression, strategy, and diplomacy, Bradley had shown that he possessed all four, wrapped in a quiet, humble package that fooled many but impressed the people who mattered most. Eisenhower trusted him. Marshall trusted him. Patton respected him. And the soldiers under him believed in him. North Africa had been his trial by fire. And now the next chapters awaited him. The steep mountains of Sicily, the brutal fighting in Italy, the planning of D-Day, and ultimately, the liberation of France. Bradley had stepped into the war as an unknown. He would leave North Africa as a rising star, but the greatest challenges and the hardest decisions of his life still lay ahead. The victory in North Africa marked a turning point not only for the Allied forces, but for Omar Bradley himself. Until 1943, he had been a man of modest rank and modest reputation, steady, dependable, and almost invisible to the public. North Africa changed that. The American army had grown to trust him. Eisenhower had grown to rely on him. And now a new and far more ambitious operation loomed on the horizon. The invasion of Sicily, the largest amphibious operation of the war so far. For Bradley, Sicily would be more than a battlefield. It would be the place where he stepped fully out of the shadows, where he proved that his calm, disciplined leadership could guide tens of thousands of soldiers through some of the most demanding terrain in the European theater. And it would also be where he began the long road toward the greatest responsibility of his life, commanding American forces on D-Day. The strategic importance of Sicily. By mid-1943, the Allies faced a crucial question: where to strike next after defeating the Axis in North Africa. Churchill favored attacking the soft underbelly of Europe, southern Italy, to weaken Germany's Mediterranean grip and force the Italians out of the war. The Americans were more cautious, worried that diverting resources south might delay the ultimate invasion of France. Sicily, however, offered something both sides could agree on: a stepping stone into mainland Europe. Airfields crucial for the Mediterranean campaign, a chance to test large-scale amphibious coordination, and an opportunity to force Italy's surrender. For Bradley, this was more than strategy. It was his opportunity to lead a full-scale American army in active combat for the first time. Operation Husky, Bradley as Deputy Army Commander. In the spring of 1943, Eisenhower appointed Bradley as the Deputy Commander of the U.S. 7th Army, under his old partner, General George S. Patton. Patton, with his legendary aggression and flamboyant style, would lead the Army. Bradley would serve as his second-in-command, a position requiring balance, judgment, and patience. Patton respected Bradley deeply, even if their personalities could not have been more different. Patton was restless and hungry for glory. Bradley was methodical, focused, and quietly ambitious, only in the sense of doing his duty well. Their contrast made them effective. Patton planned bold thrusts into enemy territory. Bradley ensured that the plans were grounded, practical, and supported by strong logistics and intelligence. Together, they prepared for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, on July 10, 1943. The Sicily landings, a test of nerves. The landings were chaotic. High winds scattered airborne units. Rough seas made troop landings difficult. German and Italian forces resisted fiercely in certain sectors. Bradley coordinated reports from across the beaches and ensured that scattered units found direction and purpose. Amphibious assaults, especially early in the war, were complex dances of timing, communication, supply, and raw courage. Bradley made frequent trips ashore to assess conditions in person. He never hesitated to place himself near the front if it meant gaining clarity. He once said, "No plan survives contact with the shore. Clarity comes from seeing the ground with your own eyes." This simple philosophy, practical, grounded, and deeply human, guided his decision-making throughout Sicily. The drive inland, Bradley's first major independent command. By mid-July, the American forces had established a firm beachhead. Patton, ambitious and energized, asked Eisenhower to allow his 7th Army to move aggressively west and north across Sicily. Bradley supported the plan, cautiously. When Eisenhower approved the operation, Bradley was given his first full independent battlefield command. The U.S. II Corps, the same unit he had helped rehabilitate in North Africa. This time, however, he would lead it on his own. The Sicilian terrain was unforgiving. Steep mountains, narrow passes, scorching heat, and roads little more than rocky trails. The Germans and Italians used the natural landscape masterfully, delaying Allied advances through ambushes, demolitions, and defensive strongpoints. Bradley faced 3 major challenges: terrain, steep, rugged, and ideal for defense. Enemy discipline. The Hermann Göring Division fought with skill. Heat and exhaustion. Soldiers battled dehydration and fatigue as much as bullets. Bradley's approach was calm and systematic. He avoided unnecessary frontal assaults. He emphasized flanking movements, infiltration at night, and coordinated artillery support. He studied German patterns, predicted their withdrawals, and ensured his troops pressed forward without becoming overextended. Progress was deliberate, not dramatic, but it was progress. Troina, a battle of endurance. One of the hardest-fought battles for II Corps was the assault on Troina, a hilltop town defended by the experienced German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. The terrain made it nearly impregnable. For days, American forces launched repeated attacks, only to be pushed back by heavy artillery and machine gun fire. Bradley visited the front repeatedly, walking through dust and smoke, speaking quietly with exhausted soldiers, listening to officers describe the challenges. His presence did not bring theatrics. It brought reassurance. He assessed the situation and ordered concentrated artillery from multiple divisions, coordinated infantry attacks from several directions, night movements to avoid daytime heat, and German fire engineering support to improve supply routes. It was not quick nor glamorous, but slowly, relentlessly, the defenses cracked. The Germans withdrew, leaving Troina in American hands. Patton later wrote that Bradley's handling of II Corps was deliberate and effective, high praise coming from a man who preferred fast victories. Messina, the race and the tension. As the campaign neared its end, Patton pushed for a dramatic thrust toward Messina, hoping to capture the port city before British General Bernard Montgomery. A friendly rivalry existed between the two Allied commanders, and Patton wanted to prove the Americans could reach the objective first. Bradley supported the advance, but remained cautious. He understood that the Germans were evacuating across the straits to mainland Italy, and that reckless advances might expose American forces to ambush. Still, the advance pressed forward. On August 17, 1943, American forces entered Messina, beating Montgomery by a matter of hours. Patton celebrated. Bradley observed the moment with characteristic restraint. He believed the true value of the Sicily campaign was not in who reached Messina first, but in the fact that American forces had matured, tactically, psychologically, and organizationally. And indeed, they had. Sicily transformed the U.S. Army into a force ready for the European mainland. It also marked the moment when Eisenhower realized something crucial. Bradley was not just a competent corps commander, he was a gifted leader, ready for much greater responsibility. The aftermath, Italy or France? With Sicily secured, attention shifted to the next step of the war. Churchill urged an invasion of Italy. The Americans, however, wanted to plan the invasion of France, the decisive blow of the war. Bradley returned to the United States briefly to assist in planning and was soon promoted again, becoming one of Eisenhower's key advisors for the next phase of operations. But before France could be invaded, the Allies needed a commander for the 1st U.S. Army, the Central American formation that would land in Normandy. Eisenhower had several candidates: Patton, brilliant but politically risky Hodges; loyal but less dynamic Clark; deeply talented but already committed to Italy. In the end, Eisenhower chose the man he trusted most to lead America's main effort in Europe: Omar Bradley. He was promoted to command not just an army, but eventually the 12th Army Group, the largest American force ever fielded in combat, comprising over 1 million soldiers. This was the culmination of decades of discipline, patience, integrity, and quiet leadership. But before Bradley could lead men through the hedgerows of Normandy, he had to help plan the most ambitious amphibious invasion in human history. Sicily had been a rehearsal. Normandy would be the real thing. The calm before the storm. In late 1943 and early 1944, Bradley settled into his headquarters in England, surrounded by maps, photographs, terrain models, meteorological reports, and intelligence dossiers. He worked long hours, reviewed every detail, cross-examined every assumption. He understood something that some Allied commanders had not fully internalized. D-Day would be won or lost before the first soldier stepped onto the beach. Planning, coordination, training, and logistics would determine success as much as bravery or firepower. Bradley's experience in North Africa and Sicily had taught him where amphibious landings could fail, how engineers needed to operate under fire, how commanders should communicate during chaos, and most importantly, what soldiers needed to survive. His sense of responsibility, forged in childhood, disciplined at West Point, refined across decades, guided him. He spoke rarely about personal feelings, but one officer remembered him staring at a wall-sized map of the Normandy coast one night and saying quietly, "If we are wrong, thousands of boys will not come home." For Bradley, the stakes were never abstract. Every dot on the map represented a life. Sicily had shown the world that Omar Bradley could command troops. Normandy would show the world that he could shape the course of history. The winter of 1943-1944 in southern England was unlike anything the country had seen before. Quiet villages became sprawling military hubs. Country roads were filled with convoys. Fields once used for sheep now held endless rows of tents, engineering equipment, ammunition depots, and staging grounds for the greatest amphibious operation in human history. Amid this massive buildup, one figure moved at a steady, unhurried pace. A man with a calm voice, a serious expression, and a mind that processed information with the precision of an engineer and the empathy of a father. General Omar Nelson Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, the force responsible for landing on Omaha and Utah beaches on D-Day. For Bradley, the planning of the invasion of Normandy was not simply a military assignment. It was a moral burden. Every detail, every chart, every report represented a life that might be saved or lost, depending on decisions made in dimly lit headquarters, months before the first soldier set foot on French soil. He viewed the invasion not as a grand moment of glory, but as a responsibility of such magnitude that it weighed upon him day and night. The weight of command. Bradley understood something his soldiers rarely considered. D-Day would not be one day of fighting. It would be the beginning of a long and brutal campaign across hedgerows, towns, rivers, and cities. A march toward Germany that would test the endurance of every unit under his command. As he looked at the maps covering the walls of his headquarters in Bristol, he knew that every shoreline contour, every tide schedule, every machine gun nest marked in red pencil could become the place where an American soldier might fall. Soldiers in training camps thought of courage. Politicians thought of strategy. Journalists thought of victory. Bradley thought of responsibility. He once said during planning meetings, "We cannot afford to be wrong, not even by an inch." The meeting of minds. Bradley, Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery. The planning for Operation Overlord required the cooperation of some of the strongest personalities in the Allied command. Eisenhower, diplomatic, patient, the supreme integrator Montgomery, meticulously cautious, demanding precision Patton, brilliant, aggressive, unpredictable Bradley, calm, analytical, unshakably steady. Meetings often became tense. Montgomery pushed for more troops. Patton demanded aggressive tactics. Logistics officers warned of supply chain limits. Naval commanders doubted whether the landings could succeed on contested beaches. Bradley rarely raised his voice. He listened, he analyzed, and when he spoke, the room fell quiet. Not because he was loud, but because he was respected. Montgomery once admitted privately, "Bradley sees the battlefield as clearly as any man I've met." Patton was less diplomatic, but equally honest. "Brad is damn near the only man I know who can stay calm when the whole world is falling apart." Eisenhower trusted Bradley implicitly. On several occasions, he sought Bradley's opinion before anyone else's, especially on the most difficult subject of all. Where would the Americans land? Choosing the beaches, Omaha and Utah. Selecting landing sites was the most critical decision of the planning phase. Bradley was tasked with evaluating possible locations along the Norman coastline. He studied German fortifications, cliffs and slopes, tidal patterns, underwater obstacles, terrain leading inland, potential choke points, expected enemy divisions. His conclusion was both bold and sobering. The American landings would take place on Utah Beach, relatively less fortified, with good exits inland. Omaha Beach, one of the most heavily defended sections of the entire French coast. Taking Omaha would require enormous courage and meticulous planning. Yet Bradley believed it was necessary to secure the right flank of the Allied assault and connect the American sector with British and Canadian forces landing further east. He knew the risks. He knew what could happen to the first waves of infantry. And still, he accepted responsibility for it. The Omaha problem. As planning progressed, concerns grew about Omaha. Steep bluffs, firing positions arranged like a deadly funnel, limited exits, strong German units manning the defenses, minefields, barbed wire, concrete bunkers covering every angle. If Omaha failed, the entire D-Day operation could collapse. British and Canadian forces further east would be exposed. The Germans could counterattack. A beachhead might never be secured. Eisenhower asked Bradley privately, "Can Omaha be taken?" Bradley paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of the gravity of the moment. Then he answered, "It will be costly, very costly. But yes, if we prepare for the worst." That became the foundation of his planning philosophy. Hope for success. Prepare for catastrophe. This mindset saved countless lives. Visiting the troops. The human side of command. In the months before the invasion, Bradley visited training camps across southern England. He watched men practice, scaling cliffs, crawling under barbed wire, firing at mock bunkers, navigating obstacle courses, under live fire loading, onto landing craft in the rain, disembarking under simulated enemy fire. He spoke to soldiers with the same quiet respect he had shown since Tunisia. "How's the food treating you, son? Are your boots giving you trouble? Do you know your objectives? Is your lieutenant looking after you?" He never gave speeches filled with rhetoric. He didn't promise glory or easy victory. Instead, he told them the truth. One sergeant remembered Bradley saying, "This will be harder than anything you've imagined. But you will not be asked to do anything that your commanders would not do themselves." For older viewers who remember stories of wartime leaders, this tone will be familiar. Steady, honest, deeply humane. Training the engineers, the unsung heroes. Few men understood, as Bradley did, that the engineers would be the very first soldiers to step onto the beaches. They had to. Clear underwater obstacles, dismantle mines, cut wire, blow gaps through seawalls, mark safe paths, guide infantry forward, and they had to do it under fire, often up to their waists in water, with machine gun rounds skipping across the waves. Bradley spent long nights with engineering commanders, reviewing plans, timing tides, analyzing water depths, and testing demolition charges under cold English rain. He frequently repeated a single phrase: "If the engineers fail, the Army will die on the beach." This understanding shaped every detail of his plan. The weather problem. A battle against the sea. The invasion could only take place under precise conditions: low tide at dawn, calm seas, clear skies for air support, minimal wind, predictable surf conditions. By early June 1944, the weather turned violent. Storms rolled in over the English Channel. Winds strengthened. Waves crashed violently, making landing craft impossible to control. Eisenhower's advisors disagreed on whether to delay. Naval commanders warned of wrecked boats. Air commanders feared cloud cover. Some generals insisted the Army could not be kept waiting indefinitely. Others feared the Germans would detect preparations. Bradley's voice, once again, was steady and practical. He argued that waiting too long increased the risk of German reinforcements, but launching in the wrong weather could mean disaster. On the night of June 4th, the final decision loomed. The storm had grown worse. Eisenhower called a critical meeting. Bradley spoke clearly and quietly. If the seas are too rough, Omaha becomes murder. The next day, the storm still raged, but meteorologists predicted a break on June 6th. Eisenhower deliberated for hours. Then, looking at his commanders, he finally said, "Okay, let's go." Bradley knew at that moment that the weight of the invasion and the lives of thousands rested squarely on his shoulders. The final hours, Bradley's calm before chaos. On the evening of June 5th, Bradley walked among his men as they prepared to board landing craft and transport ships. Some polished weapons, others wrote letters. Many tried to sleep, though few succeeded. He did not lecture. He did not grandstand. He placed a hand on shoulders, exchanged a few words, and offered the kind of steady reassurance only a man who deeply understood responsibility could give. A corporal later recalled Bradley walking past him and saying simply, "You'll do well tomorrow. I know you will." For soldiers facing the greatest amphibious assault in history, that was enough. The night before D-Day, hours before the landing, Bradley took his place aboard the USS Augusta, which would serve as his command ship. He carried with him maps, binoculars, reports, and, as he admitted, a sense of dread that he hid from everyone else. He later said, "Command on the eve of battle is a lonely thing." He stared at the dark waves of the English Channel and whispered a quiet prayer. Not for victory, but for the lives of the men he would soon send into fire. The road to Normandy was complete. The invasion was underway, and Bradley, the quiet general from Missouri, was about to face the hardest day of his life. The world remembers D-Day in fragments. The grainy, black-and-white film of soldiers rushing from landing craft, the chaotic images of men battling through surf and fire. The cemetery rose above the cliffs. But few remember the silence that came before the storm, the long gray hours before dawn, when thousands of young men lay on the decks of ships, thinking of home, of mothers, of wives, of fears they dared not speak aloud. Aboard the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley stood quietly near the bridge, staring into the pre-dawn darkness. The ship rocked gently. The air smelled of salt and diesel. The only sounds were the low murmur of officers conferring, the creak of metal under strain, and the faint hum of engines pushing the largest amphibious armada in human history toward the coast of France. Bradley's face was calm, but his thoughts were not. He once recalled in his memoir that as he looked across the dark water toward Omaha Beach, he felt a deep sadness for the burden I was placing on those boys in the first waves. Not fear, not doubt, sadness. This was the hardest part of leadership, sending young men into danger, from which many would not return. And yet, the responsibility could not be avoided. The world had reached a turning point. The invasion had to succeed. The Great Armada. Dawn over the Channel. As the first faint light appeared on the horizon, the sea seemed filled with steel. More than 5,000 ships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, troop transports, landing craft, moved steadily toward the French coast. It was an industrial miracle, a logistical feat unmatched in history. Bradley's first U.S. Army would land at Utah Beach, the 7th Corps under General J. Lawton Collins, Omaha Beach, V Corps under General Leonard Hedgerow. Each beach had its own challenges, but Bradley knew that Omaha was the most dangerous of all. A narrow, heavily defended sector, chosen not because it was easy, but because it was strategically necessary to link the American landings with the British and Canadian forces to the east. As the Armada approached, naval guns began firing. Their thunder rolled across the water like an unending storm. Bradley watched flashes of orange light reflect against the low clouds. He did not think of glory. He thought only of the men. The landing at Utah Beach. At 6:30 a.m., the first American landing craft reached Utah Beach. A surprising twist occurred. Strong currents pushed the assault force nearly 2,000 yards south of its intended landing zone. Under different circumstances, such a mistake could have caused confusion or disaster. But the officers on the beach quickly realized their good fortune. The area they had drifted into was less defended than the planned sector. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the oldest man to land in the first wave, and walking with a cane due to arthritis, surveyed the situation and uttered one of the most famous lines of the day. "We'll start the war from right here." Bradley received the report on the Augusta and nodded. He trusted Roosevelt's judgment and authorized the new landing point. Within hours, American forces secured Utah Beach with fewer casualties than expected. The advance inland began swiftly. Roads were cleared, engineers removed obstacles, paratroopers linked up with infantry. It was, in many ways, the smoothest success of the Normandy landings. But while Utah went well, Bradley began receiving deeply troubling reports from the other beach. Omaha Beach, the worst managed piece of real estate on Earth. Omaha Beach was a nightmare waiting to happen. The beach was narrow, funnel-shaped, overlooked by steep bluffs, fortified with concrete bunkers, protected by minefields, covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. In short, it was a death trap. Bradley knew it would be hard, but he did not know how badly the landing would unfold. The first wave almost destroyed. At 6:30 a.m., the first assault troops of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stepped from their landing craft into rough water. Many found themselves chest deep, struggling under the weight of equipment. Then, the German guns opened fire. Machine gun rounds tore through the waves. Mortar shells exploded among men still in the surf. Tanks, meant to support the landing, had sunk in the stormy waters. Amphibious engineers were cut down before they could clear obstacles. On the bridge of the Augusta, Bradley listened to fragmented radio transmissions. "We're pinned down. Heavy casualties. We can't get off the beach." Situation critical. Officers glanced toward Bradley, their faces pale. Someone suggested shifting reinforcements to Utah. Another whispered that the landing was failing. A withdrawal was even mentioned. But Bradley remained steady. He did not panic. He asked one question: "Are there any signs of progress?" Reports trickled in. A few groups had reached the seawall. Small teams were crawling forward under smoke. Some engineers were blowing narrow paths through obstacles. Isolated infantrymen were scaling the bluffs near Vierville and Colleville. Bradley understood something essential. The landing had not collapsed. It was simply chaotic and brutal beyond expectation. With quiet firmness, he issued the order that defined the fate of Omaha Beach. "We will stay. Reinforce the men already there. They will find a way off that beach." This decision took extraordinary calm and extraordinary resolve. Human courage amid chaos. Bradley's orders reached the commanders offshore, and more troops began landing despite horrific fire. Rangers climbed the cliffs. Engineers cleared obstacles under direct machine gun fire. Medics treated wounded men on the waterline as shells exploded around them. Small groups of soldiers, often led by sergeants rather than officers, advanced yard by yard up the bluffs. The chaos of Omaha meant leadership came from everywhere, from corporals, privates, lieutenants. They did what had to be done, often without orders, without clear direction. Bradley later wrote that the bravery displayed on Omaha Beach was beyond anything I had imagined possible. By early afternoon, American forces finally broke through the German defenses at multiple points. The exit roads were taken. The bluffs were secured. The Germans began withdrawing inland. Omaha Beach, at the cost of enormous bloodshed, had been taken. The afternoon. A general's silent exhale. When the first solid reports of a foothold at Omaha reached the Augusta, Bradley did not cheer. He did not celebrate. He simply let out a long breath, a breath he had held since dawn. He asked quietly, "Are the wounded being evacuated?" And then, "Do we have ammo on the beach?" These questions, practical and humane, revealed his priorities: survival, support, stabilization. Finally, as the situation became clear, Bradley turned away from the mapboards and stepped onto the deck, looking toward the smoke rising from the coastline. Dozens of ships burned. Landing craft drifted empty. The beach, though secured, was covered with bodies. He never forgot that sight. It reinforced what he had always believed. Victory carries a cost measured not in territory, but in lives. Utah and Omaha united. The American sector holds by evening on June 6th. Utah Beach was firmly held. Omaha Beach was secured after one of the fiercest battles in American history. Nearly 34,000 American troops had landed. Bridges and roads inland were being captured. Paratroopers linked with infantry. Supply lines were forming. The American foothold in Normandy would expand. The German plan to throw the Allies into the sea had failed. This was the turning point of the war in the West. And Bradley's calm leadership, his refusal to panic, his steady judgment, his deep respect for the soldiers, had been one of the essential reasons the landing succeeded. A night of reflection. On the night of June 6th, Bradley remained on the Augusta, reading casualty reports, sending orders, and preparing for the next day's push inland. He did not sleep. He could not. He wrote in his memoir later, "I felt pride for what the men had done and sorrow for what it had cost them." For older generations who lived through wartime, such words resonate deeply. The leaders of that era often hid their emotions, but they felt them profoundly. Bradley bore the weight of Omaha Beach for the rest of his life. The first step to liberation. D-Day was only the beginning. Ahead lay the Hedgerow fighting in Normandy, the breakout at Saint-Lô, the race across France, the battles in Belgium, the Ardennes, the Rhine, the final push into Germany. But the greatest uncertainty was behind them. The beaches had been taken. Bradley had guided the largest American amphibious assault in history through its darkest hour. He did not do it with speeches. He did not do it with bravado. He did it with preparation, calm judgment, attention to detail, and a deep concern for the men under his command. D-Day made Bradley a central figure in the Allied victory, though he never glorified himself. He insisted that the credit belonged to the boys on the beach, and to them he dedicated every decision he made from that day forward. The beaches of Normandy were only the first step. For many Americans today, D-Day is remembered as the great moment of the war in Europe, the beginning of liberation, the end of Nazi control, the heroic assault against impossible odds. But for the men of Omar Bradley's 1st U.S. Army, D-Day was not victory. It was only an entrance. Behind the beaches lay a landscape far more hostile and far more deadly than most of those young soldiers could have imagined. Beyond Omaha and Utah stretched the Normandy countryside, a patchwork of thick hedgerows, narrow lanes, ancient stone farmhouses, sunken roads, muddy fields, and small villages that had changed little since the Middle Ages. It was a farmer's paradise and a soldier's nightmare. This was where many battles of Normandy were fought, not on beaches, not in cities, but in claustrophobic green tunnels formed by earthen walls taller than a man, reinforced with centuries-old roots and thorny vegetation. The Allies had prepared meticulously for amphibious landings, but nothing had prepared them for the hedgerows. The hedgerow problem, an unexpected stalemate. In the weeks after D-Day, Bradley's First Army pushed inland from the beaches with resolve. But progress slowed quickly. Soldiers who had survived Hitler's Atlantic Wall now found themselves trapped in the maze-like terrain of the bocage. To understand how difficult this was, imagine fields with walls so thick, tanks could not push through them. Lanes where visibility was limited to a few meters. German machine gun nests hidden behind every turn. Snipers firing from murder holes carved into the roots. Mortars placed behind the hedge tops to drop shells onto roads. Mines buried where any vehicle might pass. It was warfare unlike anything the Americans had trained for. The U.S. Army relied on mobility, firepower, and coordination. The hedgerows denied them all three. Every field became a miniature fortress. Every village became a killing zone. Every road was a potential ambush. And the Germans, particularly the veteran paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division and the elite Panzer Lehr Division, used the terrain with deadly expertise. They did not mass forces. They fought in small, flexible groups, hidden, patient, lethal. Within days, the American advance slowed to a crawl. Bradley's analysis, a general who listens. Many generals in World War II led from maps. Bradley led both from maps and from listening. He visited the frontline units, walked the narrow roads, and stood among the hedgerows himself. He watched soldiers struggle to move tanks through gaps, saw officers trying to coordinate attacks without visibility, and noticed the fatigue settling into the faces of infantrymen who fought yard by yard. A colonel later remembered, Bradley looked at us not as chess pieces, but as men trying to fight through a nightmare. His calm presence had a grounding effect. He didn't give speeches. He asked questions. What stopped you here? What would help? What do you need that you don't have? From these conversations, patterns emerged. Tanks couldn't break hedgerows without exposing themselves. Infantry couldn't advance across open gaps under German fire. Artillery strikes rarely hit hidden defenders. Communication between companies broke down constantly. Bradley recognized that the problem wasn't bravery. The problem was technique. The Army needed a solution, and fast. The Rhinelander device. American innovation under pressure. One of the most remarkable innovations of the Normandy campaign came not from high command, but from the creative minds of ordinary soldiers. A sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division, Curtis G. Cullen, devised a simple, brilliant idea. He welded metal teeth onto the front of Sherman tanks, transforming them into hedgerow cutters that could punch cleanly through the earth walls like a giant plow. The idea spread rapidly. Bradley saw a demonstration and immediately understood its value. He ordered these rhino tanks, as soldiers called them, to be installed across as many units as possible. Within days, tanks gained mobility. Infantry could follow armor more safely. German defenders lost one of their biggest advantages. American tactics became more flexible and aggressive. The hedgerow stalemate began to crack. Bradley and the Patton question, a balance of extremes. By late June, another challenge emerged. General George S. Patton, sidelined after the slapping incident in Sicily, had arrived in England, preparing to take command of a new army. Patton was aggressive, loud, and always hungry for action. Bradley was steady, quiet, and cautious when needed. Eisenhower knew that to break out of Normandy, he needed Patton's driving energy but Bradley's balanced judgment. So the plan took shape. Bradley would command the 1st U.S. Army, leading the assault on the hedgerow line. Patton would take command of the newly formed 3rd Army, waiting for the moment when the line finally broke. Bradley would open the gate. Patton would charge through it, It was a strategy that required enormous trust and would soon prove decisive. Operation Cobra. The breakout plan. By mid-July 1944, Bradley decided that the time had come to break the stalemate. His plan, known as Operation Cobra, was daring and unprecedented for the American Army. Its key components were a massive, concentrated air bombardment on a narrow section of the German front, a focused ground attack by elite infantry divisions, immediate exploitation of any breakthrough by armored units, the release of Patton's Third Army to pour through the gap and sweep across France. But the plan carried risks. Weather had to be perfect. Bombers had to strike precisely. American troops were dangerously close to the bombing zone. German defenders were still strong and well entrenched. If the bombing fell short or landed on American units, disaster could follow. Bradley reviewed the plan countless times. He consulted airmen, infantry, engineers. He questioned everything. One officer recalled, Bradley did not rush Cobra. He prepared it as if every flaw could cost a life, because it could. When he was finally satisfied, he gave the order. The bomber error, tragedy before victory. On July 25, 1944, the sky filled with aircraft, thousands of them. The earth shook as tons of bombs fell onto German lines, but then came the moment Bradley feared. Bombers dropped short. Some bombs fell directly onto American positions. Entire companies were crushed under friendly fire. General Leslie McNair, one of the most senior American officers in Europe, was killed. Bradley was devastated. He walked among the wounded after the bombing, his face gray with sorrow. He felt responsible, not because he ordered the bombing, but because he had sent these men into danger. He later wrote, "No plan survives contact with the enemy, or with the weather, or with the fog of war. But responsibility for lives never leaves a commander's conscience." Despite the tragedy, Cobra had opened a breach in the German lines. German defenders were shaken, disorganized, and falling back. Bradley had to decide, halt the attack and regroup, or push forward and risk chaos. He chose the latter, carefully but decisively. The breakout. Third Army unleashed. As Cobra gained momentum, Bradley gave the order to release Patton's Third Army into the opening. Patton moved like a force of nature, fast, aggressive, relentless. His tanks roared through the gap. Armored columns surged south, west, and east. German formations caught off balance, broke apart. Bradley commanded from the center, controlling the advance with calm precision. His orders were crisp, clear, and grounded in an understanding of logistics few generals possessed. Thanks to Bradley's careful planning and Patton's bold exploitation, the Americans achieved one of the greatest maneuvers of the war, the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket. The Falaise controversy, a decision still debated. The Falaise Pocket, where thousands of German troops were surrounded, became one of the most controversial moments of Bradley's career. The Allies had an opportunity to trap and destroy nearly all German forces in western France. But disagreements between Bradley, Patton, and Montgomery over the alignment of closing movements created a delay. In the end, a large number of German troops escaped through the narrowing gap. Battered, yes, but still capable of fighting. Historians have debated for decades whether Bradley should have acted differently. Some argue he was too cautious. Others insist he avoided friendly fire disasters and logistical overextensions. Older veterans often point out that no commander in the fog of war has perfect information. Bradley himself admitted regret. It was the one that got away, though not unpunished. What matters is the outcome. The Germans lost irreplaceable tanks, guns, and men. Their army in the West collapsed. Paris lay undefended. The road across France was open. Bradley had helped shape a decisive victory. The birth of the 12th Army Group, command of over 1 million men. On August 1st, 1944, a new chapter began. Bradley was appointed commander of the 12th U.S. Army Group, the largest American field command in history, eventually totaling 4 armies, 12 corps, 48 divisions, over 1.3 million soldiers. It was a level of responsibility few men have ever carried. He now commanded Hodge's 1st Army, Patton's 3rd Army, Simpson's 9th Army, later added, and eventually additional formations during the Battle of the Bulge. This placed Bradley at the center of the Allied push across France. He was no longer just a battlefield commander. He was a director of an entire military machine, coordinating logistics, strategy, air support, supply lines, medical units, engineering divisions, and the complex relationships between Allied commanders. Eisenhower trusted him completely. Patton respected him deeply. Montgomery challenged him often, but recognized his steady competence. Bradley's influence would now shape the final phase of the war in Europe. The race across France, Bradley's methodical command. With German lines shattered, American forces surged forward, 20 miles a day, then 30, sometimes even 40, liberating town after town, capturing bridges, rail lines, supply depots, pushing the Germans east toward the Seine. French civilians greeted American troops with tears, wine, flowers, and embraces. Bradley, though rarely in the spotlight, was the architect of this momentum. His leadership style remained unchanged, practical, thoughtful, humane, always aware of the cost of war. He prioritized logistics as much as tactics, ensuring fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical support moved forward with the speed of advancing troops. Patton once said, "My tanks run on gasoline, but Bradley's mind keeps them moving." The liberation of Paris. Bradley's restraint. When French resistance forces rose up in Paris, the world expected the Americans to rush into the city. But Bradley, ever cautious, hesitated. Why? He feared street fighting in a huge city, high civilian casualties, German demolition plans getting bogged down in urban warfare supply line overextension. But when Eisenhower approved the advance, Bradley coordinated carefully. French 2nd Armored Division under Leclerc entered 1st American 4th Infantry Division, followed German forces surrendered, and Paris was liberated with far fewer casualties than expected. Bradley's caution had been justified. The road ahead toward Germany. By early September 1944, France was nearly liberated. Bradley's armies were at the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg. Supplies were strained. German forces were retreating, but still dangerous. The next chapters would test Bradley in new ways: disputes over strategy with Montgomery, the disastrous attack on Aachen, the logistical crisis of autumn 1944, and ultimately, the Battle of the Bulge. But the soldier who had risen from Missouri poverty to command over 1 million men was prepared. He had faced the Hedgerows. He had broken the German lines. He had led the greatest army America had ever fielded into the heart of France. Now he would lead them into Germany. When the summer of 1944 faded into autumn, Europe experienced a moment of profound transformation. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of France, the German army had been pushed back almost 400 miles. Liberation swept across towns and villages in a wave of relief. French civilians embraced American soldiers, waving flags that had been hidden for 4 long years. For a brief moment, it felt as if victory might come quickly, perhaps by Christmas. But General Omar Bradley, now commanding the largest American force ever assembled, understood that the war was far from over. He knew the German army was wounded, not destroyed. He also knew that logistics, not courage, would determine the pace of progress. Ahead lay the fortified western border of Germany, the Siegfried Line, or as the Germans called it, the West Wall. Miles of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, pillboxes, minefields, interlocking defensive positions, barbed wire, and fortified towns, all designed to halt an invading army. Bradley would need all his calm judgment, strategic clarity, and steady leadership to guide his armies through the next phase of the war, the long, grinding approach toward Germany itself. The Great Advance, a logistical nightmare. In September 1944, the American advance moved with breathtaking speed. Patton's Third Army raced across central France like a lightning bolt. Hodge's First Army drove northeast toward Belgium. Simpson's Ninth Army prepared to join the front as fuel and ammunition were rushed forward. But beneath the triumph lay a crisis. The American supply system had stretched so far that trucks sometimes traveled hundreds of miles from the Cherbourg and Normandy ports to the front lines. The famous Red Ball Express, operated largely by African-American truck drivers, ran day and night, hauling desperately needed supplies. Still, the fuel never seemed enough. Ammunition ran low. Spare parts were scarce. Tanks stood idle for want of gasoline. Patton complained loudly about shortages. Montgomery demanded priority for his own operations. Eisenhower had to balance egos and realities. And Bradley, ever steady, focused on what mattered most, keeping his armies moving without breaking the logistical backbone. He reminded commanders, no army moves faster than its supply line. Older veterans who lived those days often say the same thing today. Strategy wins battles, but logistics wins wars. The strategic argument, broad front or single thrust. As the Allies approached Germany, a major strategic conflict emerged between British and American commanders. There were two competing visions. 1. Montgomery's single-thrust strategy. Montgomery believed the war could be ended quickly with a single, massive push north through the Netherlands and into Germany's industrial heartland. His plan required concentrating resources on his 21st Army Group, fuel, trucks, ammunition, manpower, at the expense of American units. He argued, unity of effort, a dramatic breakthrough, a quick end to the war. This culminated in Operation Market Garden, his airborne ground offensive. 2. Eisenhower and Bradley's broad front strategy. Eisenhower, supported quietly but firmly by Bradley, believed the Allies should advance along a wide line, keeping pressure on the Germans everywhere and preventing them from concentrating forces. Bradley's key points were: German resistance was still fierce. Narrow attacks risked disaster. Logistics could not support a single breakthrough. American forces must retain momentum. The Siegfried Line was long. It must be pressured across multiple sectors. Bradley expressed his view in his measured, understated way. We must move forward everywhere the enemy is weak and hold steady where he is strong. It was not dramatic, but it was sound. Operation Market Garden, Bradley's truest instinct, proven right. When Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Bradley was not involved directly. The operation was outside his sector, but he observed it closely. The plan called for 3 airborne divisions to seize bridges, a rapid ground advance along a single road, a narrow push deep into the Netherlands. It was bold. It was imaginative. It had Patton's flair and Montgomery's organizational structure, but not Bradley's caution. The result? It failed. The airborne troops fought heroically, but could not hold all the bridges. The ground advance bogged down. The operation left the Allies with heavy casualties and did not open a direct route into Germany. Bradley was sympathetic to the bravery of the men, but he believed the plan had been fundamentally flawed. His quiet assessment: we must not gamble with lives more than necessity commands. This phrase became a guiding principle of his command. The Siegfried Line, the return of static warfare. As Market Garden faltered, Bradley's armies prepared for one of the toughest tasks of the war, breaching the Siegfried Line. The fortified border stretched for hundreds of miles, with pillboxes carved into hillsides, anti-tank obstacles in rows, barbed wire entanglements, minefields layered in depth, and fortified towns designed to be death traps. The American soldiers who had raced across France suddenly found themselves facing entrenched defenders. Foul autumn weather, and terrain that favored the Germans. Progress was slow, very slow, and casualties rose. The battle for Aachen, the first major German city. One of the most symbolic battles of this campaign was the fight for Aachen, the first major German city to face Allied attack. Bradley's First Army, under Hodges, encircled the city from north and south. Taking Aachen was not just a tactical objective, it was psychological. It would prove to the Germans that their homeland was no longer safe. But the battle was brutal. German defenders fought with desperate intensity. Streets became battlegrounds, basements turned into bunkers. Every building had to be cleared, room by room. Bradley watched the reports come in. Running low on ammunition. Urban block fortified. Need engineers for demolition. Heavy casualties on both sides. He did not interfere with Hodges' tactical decisions, but he provided reinforcements, artillery support, and logistical guidance. He understood that Aachen had to fall, not for glory, but for momentum. On October 21, 1944, Aachen surrendered. It was a costly victory, but a symbolic one. The Allies were now inside Germany. The Hurtgen Forest, a grim and costly campaign. If the hedgerows of Normandy were bad, the Hurtgen Forest was worse, a dense maze of trees, ravines, and fortified positions. The Germans turned the forest into a labyrinth of booby traps, hidden bunkers, mines, camouflaged machine gun nests. Visibility was measured in meters. Artillery fire shattered trees, sending splinters flying like lethal spears. Mud swallowed vehicles. Fog obscured movements. American troops fought for weeks in miserable conditions. Historians have argued for decades whether Bradley should have done more to redirect or halt the attacks. The battle was primarily under Hodges' First Army, but Bradley, as group commander, carried the responsibility. He acknowledged later, "Hurtgen was among the costliest lessons we learned." It was a reflection not of incompetence, but of the brutal reality that not every battle in a vast war can be fought perfectly. Bradley under pressure, still calm, still human. Throughout the autumn of 1944, as weather worsened and ammunition dwindled, Bradley remained the steady center of an increasingly complex operation. Officers remembered him for his quiet presence at command posts, his refusal to rush decisions, his concern for the welfare of troops, his uncompromising honesty, his balanced judgment between aggression and caution. He had disagreements. Patton pushed constantly for fuel. Hodges struggled with faltering units. Montgomery demanded priority of supplies. Eisenhower had to mediate between clashing personalities, yet Bradley never let disputes overwhelm him. His leadership style was not forceful, but persistent, not loud, but effective. A general who believed that winning war was not only about tactics, it was about sustaining men, physically and emotionally, through hardship. The approach to winter, a false sense of security. By late November 1944, Bradley's armies controlled a wide front stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg. Supply lines were still stretched, weather was worsening, and the soldiers were exhausted after months of continuous fighting. But German resistance appeared to weaken. Intelligence reports suggested the Wehrmacht was incapable of major offensives. Commanders began planning for the next spring campaign. Some units prepared for rest. Bradley himself was confident, cautiously, that Germany was nearing collapse. Yet in the forests of the Ardennes, the German army was massing for one last, desperate strike. Bradley did not know it yet. No one in the Allied command truly did. But the calm before winter would soon shatter violently. Ahead lay the greatest crisis of Bradley's military career, the Battle of the Bulge. Winter arrived early in 1944. Cold winds swept across Belgium and Luxembourg. Rain turned roads to mud. Fog settled over forests like a heavy blanket. American soldiers dug into frozen ground, their boots stiff, their fingers numb, their breath turning to frost as soon as it left their lips. Many believed the war was nearing its end. The German army was retreating across every front. American troops were exhausted but confident. Christmas was only days away. Even General Omar Bradley, always cautious, always realistic, allowed himself to hope that the worst was behind them. He was wrong. In the early hours of December 16th, 1944, the quiet front held by the U.S. First Army erupted in one of the most shocking and violent surprises of the entire war. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army, had begun. And for Bradley, it would become the ultimate test of calm leadership under catastrophic pressure. A quiet front until it wasn't. The Ardennes Forest had been chosen as a quiet sector. American units there included exhausted divisions, recovering from previous battles, and newly arrived units still learning the terrain. It was considered safe, a place to rest. Bradley's headquarters, located in Luxembourg City, monitored the front, but saw no signs of danger. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were incapable of major offensives. The Allies believed Hitler's forces were collapsing. But deep inside Germany, Hitler prepared a desperate gamble. 30 divisions, 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks and armored vehicles, concentrated artillery, entire SS Panzer Corps. Their plan: punch a massive hole through the American lines, capture Antwerp, split the Allied forces, and force a negotiated peace. Bradley later said, "We underestimated the desperation of a dying enemy." The attack begins. Chaos in the forest. Just before dawn on December 16th, German artillery lit up the sky. Shells crashed into American positions. Fog choked visibility to zero. Communications were cut. Phone lines snapped. Roads clogged. Snow began to fall. Infantry divisions were overrun. Tanks pushed deep into American lines. Entire units found themselves surrounded or destroyed within hours. Messages poured into Bradley's headquarters. "We've lost contact with the 106th. Enemy armor breakthrough. Bastogne under attack. We're falling back. Rapidly." Officers at Bradley's side looked pale. Some feared the front was collapsing entirely. Bradley, however, remained calm. He studied the maps, tracing the line of attack with one steady finger. Finally, he said quietly, "This is a major offensive. They're aiming for a breakout. We will cut their spearhead." The Bulge takes shape, a gap, 80 miles wide. Within 48 hours, the German advance pushed deep into the American-held territory, creating a massive protrusion in the Allied lines, the bulge from which the battle gets its name. This bulge was not a small problem. It was a threat to the entire Allied front. The Germans captured towns, crossroads, and supply depots. Civilians fled in panic. American soldiers fought in bitter cold, often without winter gear, without hot food, and without enough ammunition. Bradley could see disaster unfolding on his maps. A huge gap had opened. Armies were cut off from each other. German spearheads were moving toward the Meuse River. A breakthrough here could split the Allied front in half. Bradley took a deep breath and issued his first major directive: hold what can be held. Delay everywhere else. Buy time. The defense of Bastogne. The anvil of the Bulge. One of the most critical points in the German advance was the Belgian town of Bastogne, a crossroads of 7 major roads. If the Germans captured it, they could move north, west, and south unhindered. The 101st Airborne Division, under General McAuliffe, rushed to the town and dug in. They were soon surrounded completely. Reports from the garrison were grim. Little ammunition, almost no medical supplies, temperatures below freezing snowdrifts, blocking roads, German artillery firing day and night. Bradley understood the importance of Bastogne immediately. He told his staff, "As long as Bastogne holds, the Germans cannot break through." When the German commander demanded surrender, McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts!" Bradley smiled when he heard it. One of the few moments of humor in those dark days. The weather hell, and the ground froze for days. Fog and snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft. This meant no air support, no reconnaissance, No supply drops, no visibility. The German offensive benefited immensely from this weather. The Americans suffered horribly. Bradley drove out to First Army headquarters to see the situation firsthand. Officers described the chaos. Soldiers fighting frostbite units, losing men to cold, as much as combat tanks. Freezing to the ground, artillery unable to fire due to ice in the breach, yet morale remained surprisingly strong. American soldiers, despite the cold and shock, held their ground again and again. When Bradley spoke to frontline officers, he did not raise his voice or pretend the situation was better than it was. He said simply, "You'll hold. Help is coming." The crucial decision: shifting command to Montgomery. As the German attack deepened, the Bulge cut communications between Bradley's headquarters and two of his key armies, the 1st and 9th. Their positions were north of the penetration and temporarily isolated from Bradley's main HQ. Eisenhower made a difficult, purely logistical decision. The 1st and 9th Armies would be placed under British Field Marshal Montgomery's temporary operational control. Bradley would retain control of the 3rd Army and other U.S. formations south of the Bulge. It was not because Bradley had failed, quite the opposite. It was simply the fastest way to improve coordination in the chaos. But Bradley was deeply upset. He felt his authority was being diminished in the most critical moment. He later admitted, "I was angry, not at Ike, but at the situation." Still, he accepted the decision with discipline. He knew personal pride had no place in crisis. This ability to prioritize duty over ego distinguished Bradley from other commanders. Patton's countermove. A goddamned miracle. The turning point of the battle came from the south, where Patton's 3rd Army had halted its offensive and pivoted north to relieve Bastogne. This maneuver, turning an entire army 90 degrees on short notice, was unprecedented. But Bradley believed Patton could do it. He told staff officers, "Give Patton the road priority, he'll be there in time." And he was right. On December 26th, Patton's armored columns broke through German lines and reached Bastogne, opening a corridor to the surrounded defenders. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end of the German offensive. The weather clears. The skies turn blue. When the skies finally cleared after nearly a week of storms, the Allied air forces returned with overwhelming power. Bomber groups shredded German columns. Fighter bombers attacked tanks, trucks, fuel depots. Airborne resupply planes dropped food, ammunition, and medicine to Bastogne. Bradley watched from a command post and murmured, "Now the tide turns." From this moment onward, the German offensive began to collapse. The counteroffensive. Closing the Bulge. January 1945 was a month of bitter fighting. Snow knee-deep, temperatures sinking to 20 degrees C, soldiers battling frostbite and exhaustion, German SS divisions launching desperate counterattacks, American tanks straining engines in the cold. But Bradley coordinated the counter-assault with methodical precision. Patton's 3rd Army pushed from the south. Hodge's 1st Army pressed from the north. Other corps squeezed the Bulge from both flanks. German units were forced back toward their starting lines. By January 28th, the front was restored. The Bulge was flattened. The German army had lost irreplaceable tanks, elite troops, fuel reserves, and any hope of mounting another strategic offensive. Bradley had endured the greatest crisis of his career. He had held firm, thinking with clarity, while others were shaken by panic. Eisenhower would later say, "Brad showed his true worth in the Bulge, steady when it mattered most." Aftermath. The cost of victory. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army ever fought. Nearly 80,000 American casualties, thousands of frostbite victims, entire towns reduced to rubble, forests turned into graveyards of trees and men. Bradley visited the field after the fighting ended. He met soldiers emerging from combat, faces gaunt, boots torn, coats frozen solid, hands shaking from cold, eyes exhausted beyond years. He spoke quietly with them, No speeches, no theatrics, just simple words. You did well. You saved lives. You saved the line. Generals rarely cry. Bradley almost did that day. An enduring legacy. Leadership in crisis. Bradley's calm during the Bulge became legendary among soldiers. He never panicked. He never shouted. He never dramatized the situation. He never blamed subordinates unfairly. He never underestimated the enemy again. His leadership held the American front together during the darkest week of the European War. And for older generations who remember wartime leaders, Bradley's conduct embodies the kind of steady, responsible command that wins wars. Not through bravado, but through reason, humility, and courage of the quiet kind. The winter of 1945 had been cruel, but it ended with a clear truth. Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had failed. The German military was bleeding. Morale was collapsing. Fuel reserves were almost gone. And Allied forces, though battered and weary, stood strong across a wide front, stretching from the North Sea to the Vosges Mountains. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th U.S. Army Group, the largest American force ever assembled, now faced the final strategic phase of the war in Europe. It would not be simple. It would not be bloodless. But it would decide the fate of Nazi Germany. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line again, the crossing of the Rhine River, the encirclement of the Ruhr, the liberation of death camps, and the final push toward the Elbe. This was the last act of a long and terrible conflict. And Bradley's calm, methodical leadership would guide the American armies through every step of it. After the Bulge, rebuilding an army. In winter, January turned to February. Snow melted, turning roads into rivers of mud. Soldiers dried their boots near makeshift stoves. Replacement troops arrived, young, inexperienced faces joining veterans who looked suddenly decades older. Bradley moved from headquarters to forward posts, evaluating his armies. Hodges's First Army, weakened by the Bulge but resolute Patton's Third Army, still aggressive, still pushing Simpson's Ninth Army, well supplied and disciplined. And soon, additional forces preparing to join the final assault. He spoke quietly with corps commanders, mapping out the next moves. His words were simple. The Bulge was their last breath. Now, we finish it. Yet even as Germany weakened, the terrain and weather remained obstacles. The Siegfried Line, which the Americans had breached once before, still stood in many places. Fortified villages, pillboxes covered in snow, interlocking fields of fire. Bradley never underestimated the enemy. He reminded officers, they will fight hardest on their own soil. He was right. The final Siegfried Line assault. In February 1945, the American armies began renewed assaults on the Siegfried Line. This time, however, things were different. German divisions were understrength. Supplies were short, fuel was almost non-existent. Many defenders were Volksgrenadiers. Older men or teenagers, morale was collapsing. Yet, the fighting was fierce. German defenders fought with a mixture of desperation and duty. Every village became a fortress. Every hill cost blood. American units advanced through mud, rain, ruined towns, and forests stripped bare by artillery. Bradley coordinated these attacks carefully, ensuring logistical support, rotating exhausted units, and maintaining constant pressure without exhausting his men beyond reason. He often reminded commanders, let's grind them down, not break ourselves in the process. The Rhine, the last natural barrier. The Rhine River was more than a geographical obstacle. It was Germany's psychological shield, a historic frontier separating invaders from the German heartland. Hitler believed the Allies could not cross it easily. He ordered bridges destroyed. He promised that the Rhine would hold. But Bradley understood the truth. Once the Allies crossed the Rhine, Germany's defeat would be inevitable. The Allied plan envisioned major crossings at Wesel, British, Oppenheim, Worms, American Patton, Remagen, unexpected opportunity. No one expected what came next. The Remagen miracle, a turning point of history. On March 7, 1945, elements of the U.S. Ninth Armored Division reached the town of Remagen on the Rhine's west bank. Their orders were to probe German defenses, not attempt a crossing. But when they reached the river, they were astonished. The Ludendorff Bridge was still standing, damaged by bombing, partially demolished, but standing. German engineers had tried to destroy it, but the charges failed or only partially detonated. The Americans could hardly believe their luck. A frantic message went up the chain. Bridge intact. German retreating. Request permission to seize bridge immediately. Bradley received the report. His first reaction was disbelief. His second was decisive. He ordered, take it, hold it, reinforce it, get everyone across. It was a moment of extraordinary opportunity. No Allied commander had expected to cross the Rhine intact. But Bradley knew a gift when fate handed him one. The Rhine is breached, chaos and courage. The fight for the Remagen Bridge was chaotic and deadly. German machine guns fired from the opposite bank. Artillery shells hit the bridge. Snipers shot at engineers. The wooden planks shook and splintered. Smoke filled the air. American infantry rushed across one by one, dodging bullets and falling debris. Engineers worked desperately to repair the structure while under fire. Anti-aircraft guns shot down German planes, attempting to destroy it. Bradley sent reinforcements immediately. Tank destroyers, engineers, entire divisions. Within hours, he had a bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine. This was the first Allied crossing of the river. The news raced across Europe. Winston Churchill shouted in excitement when he heard it. Eisenhower praised Bradley's quick reaction. The German high command panicked. Hitler, in rage, dismissed officers he blamed for the failure. For Bradley, it was a triumph of initiative and judgment. Later, he wrote, sometimes the unexpected is the hinge of history. Patton's crossing, another blow to German morale. Not to be outdone, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22nd near Oppenheim, a meticulously planned assault that took the Germans by surprise. Patton called Bradley and announced, Brad, I've crossed the Rhine. Bradley, with dry humor, replied, well, George, congratulations, but at Remagen, they walked. The two generals, different in style but united in purpose, now had armies on the German heartland. The Rhine, once Hitler's pride, had been breached twice. The Rücher encirclement. Bradley's strategic masterstroke. Bradley's next major decision would lead to one of the most decisive victories of the Western Front. He proposed a bold maneuver. His armies would advance north and south around the Ruhr Valley Patton from the south. Hodges from the north encircle the entire German Army Group B. This maneuver would trap hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, vital factories, remaining fuel reserves, the industrial engine of Western Germany. Eisenhower approved the plan. The encirclement closed rapidly. German forces resisted bravely, but were overwhelmed. On April 18, 1945, the Ruhr pocket collapsed. More than 300,000 German troops surrendered. It was one of the largest mass capitulations of the war. Bradley's judgment had been perfect. The final push, humanity amid victory. As American forces moved deeper into Germany, soldiers encountered horrors that no training had prepared them for. Bradley received first reports of concentration camps: Buchenwald, Dora Mittelbau, Ohrdruf, Flossenburg. He ordered units to document everything, stating, history must know, the world must not forget. He personally visited Ohrdruf, accompanied by Eisenhower and Patton. All three generals were shaken. Bradley later wrote, I felt sick. The cruelty, the death, it stripped away any illusion about what we were fighting. For older viewers, many of whom grew up hearing their parents' war stories, Bradley's reaction reflects the deep moral clarity of that generation. They were not only fighting for victory, they were fighting to end a darkness. The meeting of armies and the end of the war. In late April 1945, American and Soviet forces linked up at the Elbe River. Germany was finished. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Berlin fell days later. German armies surrendered across the continent. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day was declared. Bradley's armies had liberated most of Western Germany, captured the Ruhr, crossed the Rhine, advanced 400 miles in weeks, freed countless civilians and prisoners, destroyed the last German resistance. It was one of the greatest achievements in American military history, and Bradley, the quiet general from Missouri, had overseen it with calm judgment, humility, and humanity. After the victory, a moment of reflection. Bradley did not celebrate wildly. He did not boast. He thought of the men who had fallen in North Africa, in Sicily, on Omaha Beach, in the hedgerows, at Aachen, in the Ardennes, across the Rhine. He said quietly, "Victory belongs to the soldiers who carried the rifles." It was the essence of Bradley's character, a man who led millions, yet always remembered the individual. The war in Europe was over. A new world was beginning, and Bradley had helped shape it. When the guns fell silent on May 8, 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. Cities were hollow shells. Villages were ashes. Roads, bridges, and farms were destroyed. Millions were displaced. Millions more lay in graves. The soldiers who survived now faced the difficult transition from war back to peace, a transition that could be as painful as the battles they had just endured. General Omar Bradley, who had commanded over 1 million men through the hardest months of the European War, now faced a different kind of responsibility. Not tactics, not battle lines, not breakthrough maneuvers, but people. Specifically, the millions of American veterans who were returning home. Many wounded, many traumatized, many unsure how to rebuild their lives. Bradley's next mission would be profoundly human. It would shape the country for generations. And it would define his legacy every bit as much as the war itself. Coming home, a nation in need of guidance. The end of the war brought victory, but also uncertainty. Over 16 million Americans had served in uniform. Millions were returning home, physically wounded, psychologically scarred, missing limbs, burned, blinded, suffering from what we today call PTSD, needing jobs, education, and medical care. The American public trusted the military deeply and looked to its leaders for direction. President Harry Truman understood that the Veterans Administration, VA, was overwhelmed and needed a firm, compassionate hand. He chose the man whose empathy and responsibility had earned him the nickname, the Soldier's General. Omar Bradley was appointed head of the Veterans Administration in 1945. This was not a glamorous assignment. It was not military glory. It was work, hard, bureaucratic, messy work. But Bradley accepted it with the same seriousness he brought to D-Day. The Veterans Administration, a broken system. When Bradley first entered the VA headquarters, he found an agency drowning in chaos. Hospitals were overcrowded. Records were incomplete. Claims were backlogged. Prosthetics programs were outdated, and mental health services were almost non-existent. Funding was insufficient. Bureaucracy was crushing. Bradley studied the situation quietly, taking notes as he always did. Then he said something simple. Our veterans deserve better. These words became his mission. Reforming the VA, Bradley's most human triumph. Under Bradley's direction, the VA underwent the largest transformation in its history. He approached the task with the same methodical discipline he had applied to military campaigns. 1. Building new hospitals. Bradley oversaw the construction of over 50 new veterans' hospitals across the country, modern surgical facilities, rehabilitation centers, prosthetics labs, psychological care units, updated emergency rooms. These facilities would serve millions of veterans for decades. 2. Improving medical training. He recognized that the VA lacked specialists, so he partnered with medical schools, Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, to train a new generation of doctors dedicated to veterans' care. This was revolutionary. 3. A modern prosthetics program. Thousands of soldiers returned home missing arms or legs. Bradley ordered research into new prosthetic designs, greater funding for artificial limbs, specialized rehabilitation facilities, training programs for amputees to return to work. In letters to families, he wrote personally, "Their sacrifice demands our best effort." 4. Integrated mental health services. At a time when shell shock was poorly understood, Bradley insisted on psychiatric wards, trauma counseling, long-term psychological care. This was decades ahead of its time. 5. The GI Bill, education for a generation. The GI Bill gave veterans tuition for college, low-interest home loans, vocational training, business financing. Bradley made sure the program was administered efficiently. Thanks to this, millions of veterans became engineers, teachers, doctors, bought homes, entered the middle class, built families, became the backbone of modern America. The GI Bill transformed the nation, and Bradley made sure it worked. A new role, the Army's Chief of Staff. Bradley's administrative success impressed both Congress and the White House. In 1948, President Truman appointed him Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the highest uniformed position in the service. The world had already changed. The Cold War had begun. Tensions with the Soviet Union were rising. American troops were being stationed around the world. Nuclear weapons had entered the equation. Bradley now had to guide the Army through a new era. His priorities included reorganizing the post-war Army, maintaining readiness, integrating airborne, armored, and infantry units, supporting European recovery under the Marshall Plan, advising on national security policy, preparing for a possible Soviet threat. His leadership style, calm, unpolitical, practical, was exactly what the country needed. The first chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In 1949, the U.S. military created a new position to coordinate all service branches, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Truman appointed Bradley as the first man to hold this office. It was the culmination of his career, the moment when every branch of the military relied on Bradley's judgment. His responsibilities included advising the president, coordinating the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, managing national defense strategy, responding to crises, overseeing budgets, shaping Cold War policy. Bradley was respected across political lines. He was honest and impartial. He focused on facts, not ego. One senator said, "When Bradley spoke, you felt the truth, not the politics." The Korean War, Bradley's most difficult political challenge. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, Bradley faced a crisis unlike any in World War II. A sudden North Korean invasion, rapid collapse of South Korean forces, limited American readiness, international tension. Bradley supported Truman's decision to intervene. But the greatest challenge came not from the enemy, but from General Douglas MacArthur, whose desire to expand the war into China risked triggering World War III. Bradley assessed the situation calmly. Korea is the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. He opposed MacArthur's escalation plans. He feared a nuclear confrontation with China or the Soviet Union. He recommended MacArthur's removal, a deeply controversial decision. Bradley later said, "I made no decision lightly, but no general is above civilian authority." For older Americans who lived through that era, Bradley's role symbolizes a return to constitutional balance, a reminder that generals serve the nation, not themselves. Retirement and a legacy of humility. Bradley retired from active duty in 1953 after nearly 45 years of service. He was promoted to five-star general, General of the Army, the same rank held by Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Marshall. Unlike those commanders, however, Bradley never sought fame. He avoided politics. He gave quiet lectures. He served on advisory boards. He wrote memoirs, honest, reflective, never boastful. He never exaggerated his achievements. He never diminished the contributions of his soldiers. Bradley lived the rest of his life with dignity and simplicity, a reflection of his Missouri upbringing. When asked what he believed his legacy was, he said, "If soldiers remember me as fair, that is enough." Bradley's place in history. the quiet architect of victory. Historians often describe Bradley as the soldier's general, the quiet commander, the moral compass of the U.S. Army, the steady hand in storm, the man who led 1,000,000 soldiers with humility. He was not flamboyant. He did not seek glory. He did not dominate headlines. But he provided something far more important: consistency, reason, empathy, fairness, steadiness, and a profound respect for the lives under his command. His reforms shaped the lives of millions of veterans. His decisions helped win World War II. His leadership kept the peace during the early Cold War. For the generation that lived through the war and their children, Bradley became a symbol of everything good in American leadership: calm in crisis, courage without ego, duty without self-promotion. The final years, a life well lived. Omar Bradley lived to the age of 88. He passed away on April 8, 1981. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery among the soldiers he had led. On his gravestone, the inscription is simple, fitting for the man he was. He once said, "The greatest honor is to have served," and that perhaps is the truest summary of his life. When people remember World War II, they often picture iconic figures: men with booming voices, dramatic gestures, and bold personalities. Patton with his ivory-handled pistols, MacArthur with his corncob pipe, Churchill with his cigar and determined stare, Eisenhower with his warm smile and statesman-like calm. Omar Nelson Bradley was nothing like them. He was not flamboyant. He was not theatrical. He did not cultivate an image or chase headlines. And yet, in many ways, he was the most uniquely American of all the generals who rose to fame during World War II. Bradley represented something quieter, steadier, and deeply rooted in the values of the generation that fought the war: humility, fairness, decency, discipline, responsibility, and genuine concern for the lives of ordinary soldiers. He became known as the soldier's general, not because he invented the title, but because the soldiers gave it to him. This chapter explores the man behind the uniform, his character, his strengths, his flaws, his conflicts, and the personality traits that shaped 1,000,000 lives. A quiet man from a quiet town. Bradley was born in 1893 in Clark, Missouri, a rural town where life was simple and expectations modest. His father was a school teacher. His mother took care of the home. Money was scarce, but values were strong. Work hard, keep your word, take responsibility, treat others with fairness. These childhood lessons shaped Bradley for life. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not come from wealth or political connections. He did not grow up imagining himself as a warrior or a leader. He once said, "I did not seek greatness. I sought competence." This desire to do things correctly, honestly, and consistently defined his military career. A serious student, a mind. Shaped by West Point at West Point, Bradley was not the loudest or the strongest or the most charismatic cadet, but he was one of the most respected. He focused on discipline, quiet excellence, punctuality, calm judgment. He did not want to stand out. He wanted to be reliable. He was friendly, but not boastful, competent, but not arrogant, ambitious, but never at the expense of others. His classmates noticed something unique. Bradley listened, really listened, when people spoke. He absorbed details. He thought before he acted. These qualities made him a natural leader. Leadership style. The opposite of Patton. Bradley's leadership is often contrasted with that of his colleague and friend, General George S. Patton. They were opposites in almost every way. Patton, flamboyant, emotional, impulsive, hungry for glory, loved by the press; unpredictable Bradley, steady, calm, analytical, concerned with safety of his men, avoided media attention, predictable in the best sense. And yet, these differences made them a powerful team. Bradley often supported Patton's bold ideas, but shaped them with logic and caution. He said of Patton, "A good army needs a Patton, but it also needs someone to keep Patton from going too far." This balance of extremes became essential in the European campaign. Bradley's greatest strength: a calm, logical mind. Bradley's genius lay not in dramatic battlefield maneuvers, but in judgment, logistics, coordination, timing, preparation, human management. He understood that war is not won by sudden bursts of glory, but by moving supplies, sustaining morale, reinforcing weak points, rotating exhausted units, maintaining pressure without overextending. His calm presence reassured soldiers and officers alike. When crises erupted in Tunisia and Normandy, at Omaha Beach, during the Bulge, Bradley never panicked. He analyzed. He adapted. He made decisions deliberately, never emotionally. A Corps commander once said, "When everything fell apart, Bradley was the man who kept us from falling apart with it." The human side: why soldiers loved him. Bradley visited frontline units constantly. He spoke to soldiers without pretense. He remembered names, he asked about families, he listened to complaints and acted on them. He did not inspire through speeches. He inspired through presence. Most importantly, he respected the cost of battle. He once told an aide, "Every man we lose is a future stolen. That must weigh on us." Bradley did not treat soldiers as expendable, a rarity in large-scale warfare. This compassion earned him loyalty that no amount of medals or publicity could buy. A moral leader. Ethics in war. Bradley believed deeply in military ethics. He rejected unnecessary risks, needless casualties, cruelty, arrogance, revenge tactics, sacrificing men for personal ambition. One story tells of a young officer who proposed an aggressive attack. Bradley asked, "How many boys will that cost us?" The officer hesitated. Bradley replied, "If you cannot answer that, you have not done your job." This moral clarity guided him from North Africa to Germany. Weaknesses and criticisms. Bradley was human. Historians often admire Bradley, but he was not perfect. He had weaknesses. 1. Not charismatic. He struggled to inspire large groups with speeches. He lacked Patton's flair or Eisenhower's warmth. 2. Too cautious at times. In Normandy, some believed he could have pushed harder earlier. At Falaise, critics argue he should have closed the pocket faster. 3. Not politically aggressive. Bradley was often overshadowed by louder personalities. He did not fight for recognition. 4. Conflict avoidance. He sometimes tolerated failing subordinates longer than Patton or Montgomery would have. Yet these flaws were human. And in a war full of egos, Bradley's humility may have been a strength more than a weakness. His most controversial moment: the Falaise Pocket. During the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, Bradley's decision to halt Patton's northward advance contributed to leaving a gap through which German forces escaped. Was this a mistake? Historians disagree. Some argue he should have closed the pocket fully. The war might have ended months earlier. He underestimated German mobility. Others argue he prevented friendly fire, avoided dangerously overextending, maintained logistical coherence, made a reasonable decision. With limited information, Bradley himself admitted, "Falaise was the one that got away." It shows his humility. He did not hide from criticism. Bradley, the administrator, slow but thorough. In staff work, Bradley could be slow and methodical, but he was thorough. He read every memo. He asked tough questions. He insisted on logistics reports. He demanded clear understanding before action. Some officers grew impatient, but others realized his careful approach prevented disasters, like those that plagued many armies throughout history. One historian said, "Bradley never rushed a disaster into existence." How Bradley worked with other generals. With Eisenhower, he had deep loyalty and respect. He admired Ike's diplomacy. Eisenhower was the glue that held the coalition together. With Patton, a complex friendship. He respected Patton's brilliance and opposed his recklessness. Patton was a magnificent weapon in the hands of a careful commander. with Montgomery professional but strained. Different cultures, different temperaments. Bradley disliked Montgomery's pride and publicity. Still, he cooperated when necessary. With Hodges and Simpson trusted subordinates, reliable and steady. Bradley valued loyalty and competence above showmanship. Bradley's personal life, a reserved private man. Bradley was not a dramatic figure at home. He was quiet, devoted, calm, loyal, affectionate, in a modest way. His first wife, Mary Quayle, died in 1965 after nearly 50 years of marriage. He remarried later in life to Kitty Buhler, a friend who provided comfort in his old age. He did not drink heavily, did not gamble, did not chase attention. He lived a disciplined, simple life. He enjoyed fishing, reading history, writing, visiting veterans, reflecting on the past. He was the opposite of the stereotypical wartime general. An honest view of himself. Bradley was open about his limitations. He said, "I was not a genius. I was a soldier who tried to do his duty. And history will judge me. I hope it judges me fairly." He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a servant of his country. Bradley's true legacy. His legacy is not a single battle. It is not a dramatic speech. It is not a bold maneuver. His legacy is leading the largest American army in history, doing so with humility, caring deeply for the lives of soldiers, guiding the U.S. through early Cold War turbulence, rebuilding the VA, helping create the GI Bill's impact, serving as the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs, maintaining dignity where others sought glory. He is remembered not for fire, but for steadiness, not for noise, but for integrity, not for image, but for substance. One historian wrote, "If Eisenhower was the coalition leader, if Patton was the sword, then Bradley was the foundation. Solid, steady, indispensable." Bradley and the American memory. For older generations who remember the war through family stories, newspaper headlines, and the images of a country united, Bradley represents the responsible commander, the decent man, the quiet strength of the American character, the leader who put soldiers first. He symbolizes a time when modesty was a virtue, not a weakness, when duty outweighed ego, when leaders led with humanity. There comes a moment in every long life, especially a life lived through war, when the noise fades, the uniforms are hung in closets, and the medals lose their shine. What remains are memories, some painful, some proud, all intertwined with the passage of time. For General Omar Nelson Bradley, the last decades of his life were spent not in pursuit of fame or public glory, but in reflection. He had guided millions of men through the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. He had shaped American military policy in the uneasy dawn of the Cold War. He had helped millions of veterans rebuild their lives. Now, in his later years, he reflected on what all of it had meant for the country, for the soldiers, and for himself. The life of a five-star general in peacetime. When Bradley retired from active service in 1953, he was already recognized as one of the most important military leaders in American history. Congress promoted him to the rank of General of the Army, a five-star rank granted only to the most exceptional commanders. But unlike some other five-star generals who embraced fame or entered politics, Bradley never sought the spotlight. He did not run for office. He did not pursue grand ventures. He preferred quiet, steady work. The same steady approach that had carried him from Missouri poverty to command of the largest U.S. Army ever assembled. He served on the board of major companies, including Bulova and RCA. He advised on military films and documentaries. He lectured at universities, sharing lessons from the war with young cadets and students, yet his talks were never boastful. He spoke plainly, with humility, and often emphasized the human cost of conflict. An officer who attended one of his lectures remembered, "Bradley never told war stories to impress. He told them to teach and to remind us of the price of mistakes." a writer who sought honesty, not glory. In the 1950s and 60s, Bradley began to record his experiences in writing. His memoir, A Soldier's Story, is considered one of the finest accounts of World War II written by a senior commander. What makes it unique is not the strategy or the descriptions of battle, though those are detailed and clear, but Bradley's introspection. He openly discussed his doubts, his regrets, the mistakes he made, the decisions that haunted him, and the heavy weight of responsibility for lives lost. He did not portray himself as infallible. He did not hide behind excuses. He analyzed himself with the same honesty he applied to his command decisions. This humility made his memoir a trusted historical source, treasured especially by veterans and their families. The memories that stayed with him. In interviews, Bradley rarely spoke about his triumphs. He spoke about the men. He remembered the soldiers on Omaha Beach, soaked, frightened, determined. He remembered the frozen men in the Ardennes, digging foxholes with bloody hands. He remembered the liberators who walked through the gates of concentration camps, stunned into silence. He remembered the faces of wounded soldiers he met in field hospitals, pale, bandaged, eyes full of unspoken questions. He often said, "I remember the boys who did not come home. They are with me always." For Bradley, victory had never been about parades or medals. It had been about responsibility to his soldiers, to their families, to the nation, loss, loneliness, and a new chapter. In 1965, Bradley suffered a heartbreaking loss. His first wife, Mary Quayle Bradley, passed away after nearly 50 years of marriage. Mary had been the quiet strength behind his career, the emotional anchor that kept him grounded through decades of war and public service. Bradley was devastated. Friends described him as a man suddenly aged, his grief deep, but never displayed dramatically. Yet life gave him another chance at companionship. He later married Kitty Buhler, a family friend. Kitty brought warmth and stability into his twilight years, accompanying him to events, helping him with public appearances, and supporting his final projects. Their marriage was gentle, dignified, and grounded in mutual respect. A symbol of a generation. As Bradley grew older, he became not just a former general, but a symbol of an entire era. To younger Americans, he represented steady leadership, responsibility, decency, modesty, and the moral clarity of the World War II generation. To veterans, he remained the general who visited the front, the commander who cared, the leader who fought for better VA hospitals, the man who never forgot the soldiers' sacrifices. When he appeared at commemorations, Omaha Beach, Luxembourg, Bastogne, elderly veterans stood a little taller in his presence. They felt he understood them, because he always had. Reflections on War, Bradley's philosophy. In his final decades, Bradley became a thoughtful public voice on war and peace. He did not glorify conflict. He warned against unnecessary wars, political ego over confidence technology, replacing judgment nuclear escalation. His famous quote is still repeated today: "Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants." He urged leaders to temper power with wisdom, a message as relevant now as it was then. Bradley believed war should always be the last resort. He believed generals must serve civilians, not dominate them. He believed the moral burden of command should humble anyone who held it. The final days. An old soldier goes home. In the late 1970s, Bradley's health declined. He continued to attend military ceremonies, though more slowly, leaning on a cane. In 1981, after a long and meaningful life, Omar Bradley passed away at age 88. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by soldiers of every rank, from young privates to senior officers. He was laid to rest with simple dignity, near the men he had led. During the ceremony, one veteran said quietly, He was the only general I ever knew who worried more about us than about his own reputation. The enduring memory of Omar Bradley. Today, Bradley's legacy endures in many forms. Streets and schools named after him, military bases and hospitals honoring his name, the Bradley Fighting Vehicle, his statues in museums, his memoirs in libraries, his leadership principles in officer training programs. But perhaps his most lasting legacy is less tangible. He showed the world that leadership does not require arrogance, that greatness does not require theatrics, that courage can be quiet, that humility is a strength, and that the lives of soldiers matter more than the ambitions of generals. For older generations, especially those whose parents or grandparents fought in the war, Bradley represents the best of what leadership can be: fair, compassionate, steady, and deeply human. The final image of Bradley. Imagine an elderly man in a simple suit, standing at Omaha Beach decades after the war. The wind is cool, the sea is calm. The cliffs rise behind him, silent now, but once filled with fire. Bradley looks out over the water, hands clasped behind his back. He is not thinking of medals. He is not thinking of speeches. He is thinking of the boys who came ashore that morning, the ones who lived and the ones who didn't. And in that quiet moment, he is again what he always was: a soldier's general. A decent man in an indecent war, a leader of quiet greatness.